which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Marlene, can you do roll call, please?
John Aldred,
Here.
Brian Burns, Francis Bach,
Here.
Del Cullum, Rick Drew,
Here.
Jim Grimes,
Yes.
Susan McGraw-Keeber,
Here.
Bill Taylor,
Here.
and Susan Vorka. Thank you.
All right. John, would you be able to reach that? Thank you. All right, we'll start with public comment. Joan Priori.
Good evening, Joan Priori. Time is growing short to weigh in about the Suffolk County Aquaculture Leasing Program. I believe your next regular meeting isn't until the end of January, so it's kind of important that whatever public input we can get might be advisable to get now. It's understandable that you wanted more input and haven't had much, but SCALP has had a great deal, and the maps they compiled, which I see on the desk, reflect it. I'm going to be reading letters or portions of letters from several local groups which will be impacted by SCALP. I think you will see that no one has any real problems with aquaculture per se. Surface gear and the location of SCALP sites are the problem. The negatives all seem to come from that. But there are also negatives with regard to the internal workings of SCALP. Excuse me. Kurt Shade's letter will address some of them. For SCALP, own benefit and everyone else's going forward, those issues should be addressed by the SCALP board and certain other government agencies as well. So I hope recommendations for that will be made to SCALP. I think it's important to keep in mind that the 22 sites in East Hampton were chosen 10 years ago by local fishermen. No one else had any input at all. Due to the advent of surface equipment, those sites are now very unfortunate. The question is, do the trustees and town board allow a mistake made 10 years ago to be carried forward into the future? If the answer is no, as it should be, then if SCALP is continue in East Hampton, the next question is, where will these sites be located so as not to be a hazard to navigation, interfere with public use of the water for recreation, and not spoil our beautiful water views? And how should oyster farming be conducted if not on the surface? The other issue, which is very understandable, is that making a living from the waters around East Hampton has been a tradition going back since the first settlers arrived, and even before that for the Native Americans. But as difficult as it is to accept, as with anything else, time never stands still and change is inevitable. There are now other segments of the population that also have a right to claim use of the water for their purposes. It becomes a problem when these factions are in conflict. That's unfortunate, but that's what we're seeing here. The trustees, town board, John and Barley, have a difficult task to try to make this work so everyone will be content and peace will reign. It will not be easy. I believe everyone wishes you all good luck and hopes that wisdom, compromise, and common sense will guide you in making your decisions. So now the letters. I have old letters here that I got from SCALP. I'm not planning to read them, but one of them is from the Association of Marine Industries. They have 100 businesses in Suffolk County, and their business yearly amounts to $1.6 billion. Basically, they are anti-surface gear. You will have a copy of the letter. Then I have another letter from a man named Josh Clausen, from the Harvest Moon Shellfish Company in Mattatuck, and he was complaining that the new oyster farmers don't seem to know what they're doing, and that without knowledge and without experience, there have been biofouling problems, oyster drills have shown up, and he says they're just unequipped to be farmers. And diseased oysters can cause diseased people and possibly, he says, even death. So that's what he's talking about. Shelter Island, there's a letter here from Shelter Island Yacht Club that says there are real problems around Shelter Island with navigation. The Seacoast Enterprises, there's a letter from Peter Mendelman, and actually he says something interesting, that until basically the trustee meeting in January 2018, nobody even knew scalp existed. It was around for 10 years and nobody knew it existed, and basically today most people don't know it exists now. So that is a problem. I'm not going to read those letters. Okay, so the first letter is from the Lazy Point Neighborhood Association. It's addressed to the East Hampton Town Trustees, the East Hampton Town Board, the Suffolk County Aquaculture Leasing Program Board. The Lazy Point Neighborhood Association would like to take this opportunity during the final comment period of SCALP's 10-year review to offer our opinion about continuing the SCALP program in East Hampton. After careful consideration, it is our opinion that there are no valid reasons to expend more taxpayer money on what is unfortunately a failed program. The goals set forth by New York State in ceding the bottomland to the county in 2004 have not been achieved. SCALP in East Hampton has served no purpose and has not provided any economic or environmental benefits. We see no hope that that will change in the future. The SCALP board is to be commended for reaching out to the public, compiling the input received, and drawing up extensive maps reflecting concerns and problems. Those maps indicate that keeping SCALP going in East Hampton waters will be difficult at best, and SCALP's inability to control the water column only makes the task that much harder, since surface gear is the major problem. Surface farming equipment is unacceptable in Gardner's and Napeek Bays due to it posing very serious hazards to navigation, impeding the public's rights to freely use the water for recreation, and the gear is unsightly, which spoils scenic water views. Gardner's and Napeek Bays are not actually bays. They are an arm of the Atlantic Ocean, and I believe also there is insufficient influx of fresh water, which oysters seem to like a little fresh water mixed in with the salt water. So they're unsuitable for farming due to rough water, and the manufacturers of surface gear clearly state it is best suited for calm waters. Besides that, the bays will not benefit from oysters' filtration capabilities. They are some of the cleanest bodies of water in the state and have no need of oysters. We are not aware of any positive SCALP can provide in support of its continued existence in Gardner's and Napeek Bays. According to SCALP's maps, Northwest Harbor is designated a significant coastal fish and wildlife habitat and historic SCALP harvest area. So those designations should render Northwest Harbor also unsuited for possible location of sites. Should the trustees and town board feel it is still worth a try, then they should recommend to SCALP that all East Hampton sites be relocated to Cherry Harbor or somewhere else on the west side of Gardner's Island. Failing that, we see only negatives for the continuation of SCALP in East Hampton's waters. We urge the trustees and town board to tell their representatives, John Aldred and Barley Dunn, to convey that conclusion to the SCALP board with their regrets. Thank you for your attention. At this point, I'd like to add something that I had never really heard about before, but it is the acidification of the oceans. Well, I'm sure that John can explain it far better than I can, or Barley, but it seems, unfortunately, on a very small scale, that if farmed oysters are removed from the water, there will be no shells left from dying oysters, and that would replace I guess it's the calcium carbonate that the shellfish need to grow their shells. So oyster farming now becomes a negative in that regard. Barley, I know, had thought to start a local program to collect oyster shells and put them back in the water. He wanted to collect them from local restaurants and put them back in the water, but there's some DEC regulation that seems to have created an obstacle to that plan. So in a small way, I guess, oyster farming is not a very good idea, but it's not the whole ocean, but on a small scale. Okay, so the next letter is from Jim Matthews, who is the chair of Northwest Alliance. It's addressed to Dear John Aldred and Rick Drew. Thanks to you both for inviting the involvement of the Northwest Alliance in the discussion about the possible installation of commercial oyster beds in Northwest Harbor. We appreciate John's presentation to a group of us and Rick's circulation of his own written thoughts on this matter. After registering the reaction of the people to those presentations, I can say with complete certainty that our group does not welcome the placement of commercial oyster beds in Northwest Harbor. Not one of the 28+ people who shared their view of this proposal expressed anything but disapproval. Generally, the reactions emphasized the adverse effects of oyster beds on the natural ecology of the area, but many were concerned about the interference with the current and growing recreational use of the harbor. Finally, there was a strong concern about the effects of the hardware supporting the beds on both the safety of the other users in the area and about the aesthetic damage they would do. Thanks very much for including us in this discussion, and we certainly would be willing to participate further in the process of evaluating this proposal. Very sincerely, Jim Matthews, Chair, Northwest Alliance. And then he says, Northwest Harbor is designated, again, significant coastal fish and wildlife habitat, and also a historic area for scallops on the scallop maps. The next letter is from the concerned citizens of Gardiner's Bay, and this is a statement they made at the January 9th meeting. We are a group of local homeowners and frequent users of Gardiner's Bay and Napeague Bay. Many of us have homes on the bay. All of us use and enjoy the bay. We swim, fish, sail, paddleboard, kayak, canoe, kite surf, windsurf, boat, and more on the bay. We do not support allowing surface equipment and gear to be placed in locations that are frequented by boaters, sailors, and other recreational users, or that destroy the scenic views of residents and visitors to our nearby parks. To the extent that decisions are being made on where to locate such surface gear in Gardiner's and Napeague Bays, or where submerged gear should be required, we request a seat at the table, and there are 55 signatures on that. The current letter that Michael Patrick has written, addressed to John Aldred and Barley Dunn, as representatives of the East Hampton Town Trustees and residents of East Hampton, with a copy to Susan Filipowicz of SCALP. Michael Patrick says, for the citizens of Gardiner's Bay, gentlemen, the citizens of Gardiner's Bay is a group of more than 50 East Hampton residents, most of whom own property and reside in Amagansett along Cranberry Hole Road and in the general Napeague Bay vicinity. We have been following the SCALP program and 10-year review process and attended SCALP meetings and met with our legislator, Bridget Fleming. As you will see on our website, we support the goals of aquaculture and the town's own program, but have serious concerns about scalp. We understand from the discussion at recent trustee meetings that you, as our representatives, must provide your recommendations to the 10-year review advisory committee, and we ask that any recommendations you make reflect our concerns. 1, we frankly don't think the bottom land the county controls starting 1,000 feet from shore is appropriate for oyster cultivation, period. Gardeners Bay is very open and exposed and too rough for floating gear. And the oyster farmers say the bottom has far too much sand movement for gear to be placed on the bottom. And why should we have any scalp lease sites in the waters of the town of East Hampton at all? If the town chooses to accommodate the scalp program, and we see no compelling benefit to East Hampton residents to do so, any equipment used to farm oysters must rest on the bottom with minimal floating marker buoys that navigation is not blocked or imperiled, and so that our scenic vistas are not destroyed. 2, we have heard that some people think it would be, okay to have 6 sites for floating gear near the fish factory. We don't like this idea. Many of our homes look directly out at these waters, and many of us live on the water so that we can fish, paddleboard, and boat in that area. We think any scalp leases that remain in East Hampton after the 10-year review should require gear to be bottom only. If the, I think it's the Fishermen's Advisory Committee, should require, if the Fishermen's Advisory Committee can refuse to have any scalp leases where they fish, then we have the right to refuse scalp leases where we use the bay for recreation or scenic enjoyment. Please read our petition on our website. We feel our views are reasonable. This petition has gone viral with several hundred East Hampton residents supporting our views. Thank you, Michael Patrick. Their petition actually has over 2,000 signatures, but they're not all East Hampton residents, obviously. So there's only one other, well, no, there are 2 other letters. This one is from the Breakwater Yacht Club in Sag Harbor. It's addressed to Sarah Lansdale, who's the Chief Environmental Analyst of SCALP. It was written by Luke M. Babcock, who is the Commodore of the Breakwater Yacht Club. I'm just going to go through this very quickly. Dear Ms. Lansdale, I am writing to provide feedback to the SCALP 10-year review plan, and more specifically, the new maps released on November 20th. I appreciate the hard work that you and the other officials have done on this project, and I have a few comments and possible amendments to the recent maps. Then they thank SCALP for their work, and they say, my concern with the maps is a few instances which I will note by page number, and they basically refer to sailing routes, high boat traffic, wind and kite surfing. I want to address specific proposals to concentrate oyster farming in Northwest Harbor due to less intensive residential development. Water usage is what matters the most, especially for floating gear in Northwest Harbor. It is one of the most intensely used areas for marine recreation within the entire Peconic estuary. Uses include sailing, cruising, sailing, racing, sailing school, windsurfing, kite surfing, paddleboarding, water skiing, kayaking, swimming, fishing, shellfishing, scalloping, etc. Our organization has operated our junior sailing program in these waters for 30 years, teaching hundreds of children each summer. Finally, I want to address the safety and navigational hazards of floating gear, especially at night or on a sailboat with limited maneuverability. As a recreational oyster grower myself, I understand that bivalves grow faster at the top of the water column. However, that is not the natural state of wild oysters, and therefore should not be considered an absolute right for oyster farmers. I could see where there may be some remote, untrafficked, shallow area where it may be permitted. I strongly believe that it should be a rare exception rather than the norm. Speaking for our waterfront organization, we wholeheartedly support shellfishing industries and the county's effort to encourage and sustain a working waterfront. I think you have done a generally good job of listening, et cetera, and it's signed Luke Babcock, Commodore of Breakwater Yacht Club. The next letter is from Kurt Shade of the Devon Yacht Club. I think he addresses some very important points, and before I read it, I would like to hand out
Hey,
these.
Joan,
Yeah,
is that the last letter?
yeah,
you're reading?
the last letter, okay? But, you know, the public,
No, but you know what it is? We probably should have considered this a little better. We got several people here for
I
general
understand that.
business.
Kurt's letter is not short, but it's extremely
Okay,
important.
could we possibly do this? Okay, clearly this discussion's gonna need more than 5 or 10 minutes. We've got Will Bowman here for Georgia Pond. We have Jim Walker here for an application. If we could sort of pool the oyster discussion to a little later on in the meeting.
Later on in the meeting.
Well,
Yeah.
after, we have 1, 2, 3 other subjects in public comment.
Okay,
Everything else is about oysters.
okay,
Yeah.
because Kurt's letter is extremely important, so.
No, I'm sure it is,
It
but
really-
you know what's happening is we're kind of filibustering
I
this meeting.
understand.
Can she finish her letter, and then we'll take a break? Is that fair? One more letter?
Well, Kurt's letter is the next one. It's longer than the others. It hits really, really critically important
Okay.
points, but if you want to wait.
No, but I would like to hear a little, quite honestly, I'd like to hear a little bit of dialogue on both sides of this issue, rather than have one individual sort of dominate this
But
discussion.
there's other
Okay.
ones.
No, I know, but I'd like to just,
Is this the letter same letter you passed out last time?
Is this the one I passed out?
Yeah.
No, it's not. No, these are really, I mean, he really is very specific about, if you want to
no,
wait, I'll wait. But
it's not like
his
we want
letter-
to deny anybody the opportunity.
No, his
here.
letter
Just think it would
really,
be
really
more
needs
fair
to be
some of the
heard.
other business
Okay.
before us.
All
I think
right?
if we only have one letter, let's,
One letter
read the
left,
one letter
but it
and then
really
move on.
is the most important letter, which is why I put it last. Maybe I should have put it first. Okay. I will see you later.
oh, I thought you were going to read your
Why don't
letter.
you read it now?
Yes, let's
Okay.
close out,
read the
read the letter,
Read it.
and then, then we move on. But it's only one more letter, Jim, so.
It's only 150 pages.
That's what I was afraid of.
How big?
There's charts and all sorts of stuff.
Oh, well,
But I want to give
Okay.
each one of you one of these.
That's the letter.
all right. I thought we actually heard a letter from Mr. Shea. Did we not? Yeah,
Just these fall out.
I thought we did have this read to us, but okay.
This is a new one.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Oh, yes, okay.
This is another person signing up. Said
Another
each
person,
name.
okay. Michael, okay, Mr. Mahoney
Where is Kurt?
signing up. Michael Mahoney.
That one, Darlene. You know, just give me
Everybody got a copy? Okay, this is to John Aldred and the East Hampton Town Trustees, the East Hampton Town Board, from Kurt Shade of the Devon Yacht Club. Regarding commentary regarding input from our appointed representatives to Suffolk County Aquaculture Program 10-Year Review Advisory Committee. Well, he says I'll keep my comments brief tonight, as I have commented before and submitted documents to John Barley, the trustees, and town board. Comments are as follows. The existing lease sites in East Hampton are the result of incomplete input 10 years ago. If the thorough input gathering that the county has conducted in 2019 had been conducted 10 years ago, there would be no scalp lease sites in the town of East Hampton waters due to the obvious navigational conflicts. So if you look at the map, you see all the lease sites. But now we have the opportunity to correct this past error and to address these lease sites. I think it's important for you to understand the status of the lease sites in East Hampton by looking at that little attachment which shows the status of all 22 lease sites in East Hampton. So take a look at that, and as you can see, the county has issued 7 leases in East Hampton, and 5, possibly 6 of them, are in default. They have been vacant for anywhere between 3 to 7 years out of their 10-year lease term, as detailed in the scalp lease document. I'm not going to read the details. Proposed solution to the mistakenly placed 22 lease sites. Lease sites 838 through 847, they're the ones on the left, create major navigational conflicts and should be eliminated from the program or mandated to be farmed with gear that rests on the bottom with minimal surface floats as originally intended. The only installed lease site in this cluster is 841. I believe that's at the bottom on the left side. And that installation can easily be relocated to vacant lease site 849. This is on the right side. The county has the right to relocate leases as detailed in their lease document. I'm not going to go into what, they just have the right to do it. Now, lease sites 848 and 853 also present conflict with recreational boaters. So those are the ones on the right side. But speaking only from our perspective, we can tolerate floating gear in this area, although gear on bottom would be preferred. The residents that own the adjoining properties should be consulted regarding their opinions on those sites, and that would be the Friends of Gardeners Bay. I read that letter. Now, lease sites 854 through 859 are the ones that are strung out in a line. They're on the southward shore-facing side of a very heavily used navigational channel, and therefore they pose very serious hazards and should be mandated to submerge equipment or removal from the program entirely. Requiring aquaculture leases to be farmed with gear on the bottom is not a hardship. It is the stated method of operation according to the county's program management guide. 85% of all installed leases in the Scout program are farmed with gear on the bottom. Then he goes on to describe bottom farming. I'm not going to do that. The proposed solution to the erroneously located 22 sites is consistent with the alternatives the 10-year review advisory committee has put forth. And those are: Alternative 1, eliminate all motivations for objection. Alternative 2, impose conditions of eliminating floating gear. Alternative 3, divide cultivation zone into 2 parts, all types of gear allowed, no floating gear allowed. Alternative 4, cluster lease areas. We have nothing against aquaculture per se, and in the spirit of compromise, we have proposed these solutions. However, we think the trustees and town board may want to consider whether they want any county lease sites in town waters for the following reasons. Aquaculture, particularly with floating gear, is intended for calm, protected waters, which are typically close to shore. The program is fatally flawed in that the bay bottom the county has the rights to begins 1,000 feet from shore, and in the town of East Hampton, there are no calm and protected areas 1,000 feet from shore that are suitable for aquaculture. Exposures are too great and the surface too rough for floating gear, and the oyster farmers say The bottom has too much sand movement and the oysters get smothered. The county is trying to put a square peg in a round hole when trying to put leases in Gardiner's Bay. There simply isn't any area of the bay in the town of East Hampton, 1,000 feet from shore, that is suitable for aquaculture and will not be in conflict with fishermen, recreational boaters, or property owners who don't want to look at acres of floating steel and plastic. This is the county's problem. Let's not make it ours. We can be pro-aquaculture without being pro-scalp. The program is a regulatory mess. The county only has the right to give out leases to the bottomland and no control over the use of floating gear. The Coast Guard, DEC, and ACOE, that's the Army Corps of Engineers, also fail to regulate the program because they think the county is doing it. The program is in violation of numerous laws and regulations that scalp administrators and regulatory agencies are either unaware of or are flagrantly violating. The Army Corps of Engineers is issuing leases that permit floating gear under a nationwide permit, which is NWP 48. However, the first condition of an NWP 48 to be valid is that no activity may cause more than a minimum adverse effect on navigation. Clearly, blocking out 10-acre squares that are 1/8 of a mile long on each side creates much more than a minimum adverse effect on navigation. The DEC's own ordinance, OGC 9, states that waterways that are affected by tides are navigable in law, and the public has the right to navigate these waters regardless of who owns the bed or whether the waterway is posted. We have spoken with the DEC Council, and they are now looking into this. The right to navigate public waters is well-established law, and the DEC knows it. Floating scalp leases are in direct violation of the town of East Hampton's LWRP. The stated goals of the LWRP are to preserve and increase access to our coastal assets. The LWRP describes the area where the scalp leases were located as follows. The sheltered waters of Gardiner's Bay and more open exposure of Navigational Bay bordering the Reach receive extensive boating use of all types, including sailing and motorboating, canoeing, kayaking, rowing, windsurfing, water skiing, and the rest. Devon conducts a sailing school and children's camp and holds periodic sailboat races on courses marked out on Gardiner's Bay. Could we find a worse floating gear oyster farm? The town's LWRP was produced in 1999 and was accepted by the state and became law in 2007. Yet no one seems to be paying any attention to it. To quote our own LWRP, the premise of the LWRP is that local policy should have a strong voice in coastal management, especially as it affects actions by other levels of government. This is accomplished through a consistency review process whereby proposed actions originating from or coming before a state, DEC, or federal, Army Corps of Engineers agency are reviewed for consistency with LWRP policies or standards. Local actions are reviewed by designated units of local government. In brief, while the LWRP adapts state policies to meet local policy needs, the consistency review process results in state agencies complying with and enforcing local standards. Which designated units of local government are paying attention to this? Per the required consistency review process, the floating lease applicants must fill out a Federal Consistency Assessment Form, FCAF, and certify their leases will cause no reduction of existing or potential public access to or along coastal waterways. And they must certify that the proposed activity will not occur within and/or affect any area covered by a state-approved LWRP. If you look at your map, the floating gear installed in Site 841, that's the one on the bottom left, is clearly in violation of FCAF as it is in an area covered by a state-approved LWRP. The program is unsuccessful, unsupervised, and dangerous. We have visited all 50-plus lease sites the county lists as leased, and over 80% are vacant and in default. Of the ones that are installed, 100% are in violation of requirements for Coast Guard-approved lit marker buoys, and many have drifted out of their lease sites. And if you add to that the appropriate lighting, if required and installed, and it being necessary, but then it becomes an objectionable eyesore to the people who see it from the shore at night. While other states require users of floating gear to be bonded and carry liability insurance, it is not clear that SCALP requires any insurance. So by tacitly approving this unregulated SCALP program through the acceptance of leases in local waters, the town may be taking on considerable liability when an accident occurs due to floating obstructions. 10 years ago, the fishing industry rejected any lease sites in areas where they actively fish, and we respect their right to insist upon public access to town waters. Similarly, we want to make sure that the recommendations of our appointed representatives also reflect the rights of the many residents, marine industry business owners, and users of the bay to reject floating lease sites where they conflict with public access to our heavily used recreational areas in the bay. The 10-year review process affords us the opportunity to correct the mistakes made a decade ago. And with careful, inclusive planning, we can create a more collegial and successful aquaculture industry in East Hampton. Let's not squander the opportunity the county is giving us to get this right. Thank you.
Thank you, John.
No applause.
Okay, Will Bowman?
Good evening, members of the board. My name is Will Bowman, Land Use Ecological Services, agent for the applicant, the Friends of Georgica Pond. I understand the board has a large agenda tonight, so I just wanted to make myself available to provide a summary of the application, answer any questions that the board may have. I can do so now or during the committee portion of the meeting, whichever the board would prefer. So at this public comment phase, I just wanted to open myself up for availability and let the board either take me up on answering any questions or let the board move to other items.
Okay, well, I mean, I think our board is pretty familiar with the algae harvester. We've supported it in the past.
Yeah, I
We
think we-
continue to support it, and
Will, have you developed an operating plan for 2020?
Yes, there's a site plan that was submitted with the application, so we identify, the primary harvest areas.
Okay.
So similar to past years, and the methodology would be similar to the aquatic harvest in the past.
Thank you.
Thanks.
The methodology would be similar to to what's done in the past, with the emphasis being on the headwaters of the various coves. The site plans lay out the place where the harvester would be launched and where harvested biomass would be unloaded from the pond at one of 5 locations, taken to loaded via truck and taken to the East Hampton transfer station. So the methodology would be the same, the harvester would be the same.
Are the locations the same as they were?
Yes, I believe we may have added one auxiliary, one that was used once or a minor amount in the past, but yes, they're all the same location.
Because having witnessed the pond when it was terribly polluted and had loads of macroalgae on it, I felt the weed harvester really helped to remove excess nutrients from the pond. I know there were some concerns of possibly the need for a monitor to make sure there wasn't, in effect, bycatch of small finfish or crabs or other species.
With the application, the Friends of Georgia Pond and SUNY Stony Brook have been monitoring this project for a number of years. With the materials submitted, were included monitoring reports from 2016, 17, and 18. The 2018 report has an analysis of the biological monitoring that was done of biocatch. Stony Brook, took some subsamples, harvested material, counted finfish and such that were observed. They did trapping of finfish, blue crabs, invertebrates, also used seine nets and lift nets to kind of analyze both bycatch and abundance of finfish and invertebrates, both inside and outside the harvest areas. Their conclusions were that there were no significant adverse impacts on the fish and invertebrate communities when looking at harvest areas versus non-harvest areas. So we submitted all that for the trustees review. Work like that would continue, and also we've started monitoring of the species aquatic plant distribution and abundance throughout the pond. That was first started in 2019 and will continue on. So there is monitoring kind of proposed and to support the project.
Okay, it'd be great, if there are some milestone dates for some of that monitoring or meetings to keep us abreast of that.
There have been annual reports, and they'll continue to.
Great.
And do you have a report on the emergent plants, vascular plants in the pond yet?
It has not. All of the aquatic plant harvesting has been submerged aquatics. So that was and the harvesting is trying to, we're avoiding the nearshore macrophytes.
But wasn't part of the DEC's issue with the project thus far was the fact that there was no baseline for the submerged vegetation, and has that now been established?
Yes, Stony Brook took their first sample data in 2019 at 40 locations in both June and September. Lake rakes were used to kind of sample both the species diversity and abundance at locations within the harvest areas.
Is that information available yet?
That's not in that yet. We've gotten the preliminary data. It was not submitted with this, but it will be when Stony Brook has finished the reports.
Okay. Now, where is Friends of Georgia with the application before the DEC at this point? Have you submitted?
Yes, it has been submitted. It was submitted around the same time as the trustees' application.
Has it been deemed complete?
Not yet.
What about the town?
The application was also submitted to the town.
There was a really good harvest of white perch out of the pond this past spring, so I'd be interested to hear more about perch populations in the pond if, you guys are doing the seinings, Dr. Peterson, et cetera. So it'd be interesting to see if that's sustainable. You know, is the pond really taking a true uptick in the quality? I mean, visually, it's like a brand-new water body. It's almost miraculous how great the pond looks from 5 years ago. So,
I'll relay the emphasis on white perch trajectory.
thank you.
Is the committee that you guys are on with the village and the town and trustees on this?
Actually, meeting
Got
later this
together
week.
Thursday, I
Discuss
think.
this at all?
Yeah, we,
Meeting
The meeting
on
Thursday. This was a great program. I think this board's going to support it completely. We were a little disappointed when it got stopped, to tell you the truth.
Yeah, I mean, the feedback from the recreational community was the pond has been much healthier and much appreciated all the effort of the Friends of Georgica. And people are out there kayaking, paddling, sailing, crabbing, so it's great. And the baymen have been successful, so by all accounts, observationally, it seems like we're making improvements.
We look forward to relaying all the data that's been collected and trying to get through all of the various regulatory hurdles along the way.
Anybody else? No?
Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Very good. Thank you very much.
hey, Will, if you want, there's some honey in those boxes there.
Oh,
I know you guys are gonna bolt on us here in a minute. Merry Christmas.
home go, no, here.
Seriously, okay.
Yeah, this is,
Wasn't
this
school.
is,
Usually people at hearings, I don't go away with
this is
party
Jim's
gifts.
special
Yeah, well,
homegrown.
Sarah's gotta get one too. Hey,
Here.
don't bogart the honey.
There you go.
All right. Mike, do you mind if I have Jim Walker go before you? Thank you.
He's quick.
Yeah.
Okay, Jim Walker from InterScience. I'm here for Devon Yacht Club. Devon Yacht Club has 2 applications in front of the trustees. Arlene just got one in the mail
Yes.
recently. The one that we have the quickest need for expires tomorrow. So the maintenance dredging permit allows maintenance dredging here, put the spoils there. The spoils are available for the trustees. That's been the agreement in the past. Also includes removing some of the sand that accumulates at the main dock.
They spread it on the beach, nothing's changed.
Project has been approved since I started working for Devon Yacht Club in 1985, and it seems to be running smoothly. Last time I spoke to the trustees, we did not have an Army Corps permit. We still do not have an Army Corps permit. The Army Corps has indicated that they're going to issue a 1-year approval, and then next year we're going to get a 10-year new Army Corps permit. The application was filed 2.5 years ago, just so you know. And,
When do you expect this to come through? Have you any idea?
soon, I hope,
Hey, Jim, this, is the Army Corps permit for the jetty or for the dredging?
dredging.
Okay.
So if they know they're going to give you a 1-year permit, why not just issue the 10?
You need to call them, Francis. I can't answer questions that deep.
Just wondering.
Hey, Jim.
I try to stick with nuts and bolts.
Speaking of how deep, how much spoil do you propose?
1,200 yards.
About 1,200.
It's a little bit dependent on northeasters, how much sand gets thrown over top this jetty into the entry to the boat.
This is the same thing you do every year.
Same thing. Not in 1985. Actually, 1 year recently also wasn't needed. We didn't have storms that dumped the sand over top. So we sent Walbridge out there a couple times, and they determined the depths were okay, so it wasn't dredged. That was probably 4 or 5 years ago. The other project that we have, which Arlene just got the paperwork on, 73 linear feet of jetty replacement. I spoke briefly with the trustees in this regard. You just got the application. We have a DEC application. We do not need an Army Corps permit. We have a town NRSP application. And that project, I reviewed my plans and notes on, includes 26-foot sheets of fiberglass sheet piling. The other side was replaced with aluminum sheet piling. These last two jetties are the last projects I know that were not done since I started working for Devon in 1985. So what we have here right now is a single row of fiberglass sheet piling, a double row of piles through bolted on either side.
That's what's proposed, Jim?
That's what's proposed.
Okay, could I ask why we're proposing fiberglass? Because clearly that the aluminum on the other side seemed to have worked really well. Why are we switching materials all of a
I
sudden?
think the contractor recommended the fiberglass sheet piling, Jim.
What's your experience with that?
My experience with fiberglass sheet piling is we use it in areas where there's some exposure to wind and wave action. I've never seen it used for a jetty application, so I'm not certain how it will do in this particular area. The aluminum on the other side was used at the town of Southold Park, and has been there for more than 20 years. So we had a good basis for proposing aluminum sheet piling on this side. Fiberglass sheet piling is much stronger than plastic.
No, I understand that. The only thing, just knowing how fiberglass responds to sand scouring, I just wonder how durable it's going to be in the long term. I mean, once you chew through the gel coat and you're exposing cloth and stuff, is that an issue?
I think I haven't heard from the DEC yet, and I don't need a trustee's permit this month or in a few days. We have some time, and I can explore it with the contractor.
Right.
And explore it with Devon Yacht Club and get back to you. It would be nice if the trustees could issue a new one-year permit for maintenance dredging. That's important because our permit does run out, and I need it to be in place when the Army Corps decides to issue the one-year
All right.
maintenance dredging.
I'd like to make a motion that we approve the annual dredging
I'll second that.
permit.
All in favor?
Question, doesn't Clearwater have fiberglass at their,
No,
It
I think
depends
they're
on-
plastic.
Yeah,
Head
vinyl.
of- The head of the harbor is
The new
proposed
one.
It's
fiberglass.
I thought it was
inside the
fiberglass.
harbor.
Yeah.
Clearwater has steel sheet piling.
Yeah.
I mean, all the way out to the inlet and in the front of the inlet.
Yeah.
And the rest of it is plastic sheet piling, but that's inside a hog.
Right, inside, okay. 'cause
I got the permits
That was
for
a
it.
lot of the replacement.
Yeah.
You know, there's 1,200 feet of bulkhead.
Yeah.
It was quite a big effort.
Out of,
Does the contractor think because it's protected from a little action by the other bulkhead that, or the other jetty, it might be,
I don't think anything's protected in
Yeah, I
Gardner's
think-
Bay.
looks like you should consider aluminum.
Well, we'll speak to the contractor and to Devon Yacht Club, and we'll come back to you. Again, I really don't need that permit tomorrow. We haven't heard from the DEC yet, and Arlene just got the paperwork.
Okay, we haven't voted on this. Do we have a second?
We
Bill.
voted, we voted.
All in
Seconded it,
favor?
and we all said,
We voted.
Okay.
yeah.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
You got it. You got it.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Right.
Thank you
Jim,
for
if you
coming.
want-
Take some honey.
When you, come back. You have a free hand?
It's worth the second trip.
Next, Mike Dole?
Yeah.
Thanks.
You know, you can use this, Mike.
Okay.
Takes it, look at that.
Mike, can you introduce yourself, please?
Sure, yes. My name is Michael Dole. I'm the Associate Director for Bivalve Restoration at School of Marine Atmospheric Sciences at Stony Brook University. Thank you for allowing me to come here today to talk to you about an oyster study that we just started in Georgia Pond this past year. The study is a part, it's the newest component of a larger study that Dr. Gobler's been conducted in Georgia Pond, I think since 2015, right about. The studies has been designed to try to understand the suite of environmental problems that have been plaguing Georgia Pond. Not only just to understand it, but to find mitigative solutions for some of these problems. And that's what this oyster part is about, trying to provide a solution. So before I just jump into the oyster study, I just want to just kind of quickly very quick, and I know you know this better than anybody from the talks that Dr. Goebel has given over the years, but I just want to quickly review, very quick, just some of the problems and why we want to put oysters in there, okay? So, very quickly, macroalgae bloom is one of the more conspicuous things, and we kind of heard about some of that just now with the harvester stuff. But we got macroalgae blooms, and we also have microalgae blooms, phytoplankton blooms, and in this case it's a cyanobacteria blue-green algae that has lots of detrimental consequences, including fishery closures. And the reason being is these cyanobacterias contain toxins. So there's a couple species. There's a microcystin toxin and adatoxin A. These toxins can be, as you know, extremely dangerous. Across the country, as these pop up, there's been a lot of reports of dogs dying from drinking the water. So this is, you don't have to eat a shellfish or something to get sick. You can get sick directly from the water with this algae. So around the country, from these types of algae blooms, there's been reports of wildlife and dogs dying, and unfortunately, that's what happened in Georgia Pond in 2012, I believe, and which kind of was really, I think, one of the driving forces, right, behind getting all this going. So it's a serious algae bloom. And like all algae blooms, in addition to the direct toxicity of this algae blooms, like all algae blooms, when you have too much nutrients going in the system and you have these biomass loads, when it dies and the bacteria start to break it down, they use up all the oxygen on the bottom. And this is another problem that's been plaguing Georgia Pond, are these low oxygen problems. So you got blooms of macroalgae, blooms of toxic cyanobacteria, hypoxia and anoxia, which is low oxygen or no oxygen, kills of fish, eel, birds, and pets. And I didn't even mention pathogenic bacteria, but there's been closed to shellfishing for a long time. In fact, I don't even know if it was ever open to shellfishing. So we have a suite of problems, and these problems are all interconnected, and a lot of the work that Dr. Goebel has showed over the last couple of years have showed how this is all connected, and really it starts off with excessive nutrient loading going into the system, which fuels these macroalgae blooms, okay? And seasonally, they'll usually appear in the spring after the cut's open and the water's clear. You'll start to get these macroalgae blooms. Then as the macroalgae blooms die off, all those nutrients that get regenerated fuel microalgae blooms, including these cyanobacteria. And then when all that biomass dies and goes to the bottom, it breaks down and it can cause low oxygen. So it's a series of interconnected problems. And like I said, been working on mitigative solutions to try to address these problems and try to kind of break these links along the chain. So, one, as far as excessive nutrient loading goes, there's a lot of land-based initiatives to minimize nitrogen inputs to Georgia Pond and actually to surface waters around Long Island, and in particular in Suffolk County. This will involve innovative alternative septic systems, and that's part of Suffolk County's sub-watersheds wastewater management plan is really the target of upgrading septic systems in Suffolk County, which account for, I believe it's over 80% of nitrogen inputting into surface waters, and also stormwater runoff management things. So that's trying to control nutrients going in. And then just heard a little bit before about the harvesting or removal of macroalgae. That was done with this harvester to take out this macroalgae before it decays and starts releasing the nutrients that are going to fuel microalgae blooms. And just going over the results of this between 2016 and 2018, I found it totally fascinating, especially the impacts it had on improving oxygen levels in Georgia Pond. So yeah, really, really, really interesting. And then finally, to get to what I'm going to talk about is increasing biotic filtration, okay, with bivalve shellfish, okay? And I'll talk a little bit what I mean about that, you know, but the goal here is to kind of attack these microalgae blooms and mitigate this step in the, along the way. So, so why bivalves? As you know, bivalves are filter feeders, okay, so they filter the water. And when they're abundant, like they used to be, much more so in a lot of places around Long Island, when they were at those historic levels, they're ecosystem engineers, and they're a major, important part of the ecosystem. When they're in large numbers and they're filtering, they can control phytoplankton abundance, and therefore they can help reduce harmful algae blooms before they even begin. And they also improve water clarity. When you have improved water clarity, it helps fuel the growth of seagrasses, which are incredible habitat for lots of invertebrates and fish, very important habitat. When the brown tides first hit the Peconic Estuary in 1985, it was catastrophic within 1 year, as you know, wiping out the scallop population, and it was kind of a double whammy, and it was directly toxic and bad to the bay scallops, but it also shaded out all the eelgrass beds, and we lost acres and acres of eelgrass beds, which is the primary habitat for bay scallops. So down here, I put these two pictures up. I was working as a technician. This goes back to the early to mid-90s, and I was working on, when I first started, I was working on brown tide issues, and I was working with some scientists, and we were doing a bunch of studies on Shelter Island, looking at the formation of brown tide blooms, okay? So what you're looking at here, these are mesocosms, kind of a top-down view of basically a giant container, okay? So this container, it's probably about 5 feet tall, okay? I could climb into it and go like this and you wouldn't see me. This down here on the bottom, that's just to give you the perspective, that's a party bucket, like you put a keg in or something. But we didn't put a keg in it, though. We put it down on the bottom and put some clams in it. We set up various treatments. These mesocosms were actually submerged in ambient seawater, so the temperature's controlled, and they were filled with ambient seawater right from off Shelter Island. And we did different treatments, adding different nutrients and so forth, to look at the formation of brown tide blooms over time, over a couple weeks. And in a couple treatments, we put a few clams on the bottom. For me, this was the first time where I'm a visual learner, so where I really understood the impact that shellfish could have on an ecosystem, and bivalve shellfish could have on an ecosystem. I'm also a very simple person, so I like when things are simple and you can just look at something and see a result, and don't necessarily have to do a lot of statistical tests to know what you're looking at. But the result is right here. When we put clams in these, and this was replicated over and over again, but when we put clams in a treatment, the brown tide did not bloom, okay? Meanwhile, other treatments where we didn't put clams, we had brown tide blooms in all of them. So that was really, for me, an important thing. This goes back to the, like I said, the early mid-90s that kind of launched me into becoming a bivalve scientist. So out of all the bivalves, why oysters? Well, first of all, they're very good filter feeders, okay? They can filter a lot of water. They say an adult oyster can filter up to 50 gallons a day, 200 liters. And they're very efficient filterers, too. And in addition to all the ecosystem services that filtering water provides, oyster reefs also create a very valuable habitat for all sorts of fish and invertebrates, okay? What you're looking at here is a flat of oysters on a mud flat, but as reefs build up over time and they get some vertical elevation, they really make an incredible habitat. Some of the experimental oyster reefs that I've constructed in Meatcox Bay over the last couple of years, it's just been fascinating watching the habitat that develops around them. Two of the most abundant species I find utilizing the oyster reefs happen to be blue crabs and eels, and both of which, from what I understand, are very important species in Georgia Pond. And then finally, Georgia Pond seems like an ideal environment for oysters. I mean, it just seems, and I'm going to explain why. what makes it so interesting for oysters, not only interesting for oysters, but interesting for an oyster biologist. And really, it comes down to what you call the cut, right? This is the cut into Georgica Pond, and this ephemeral opening to the ocean that gets open and closed a couple times a year. This is really what makes Georgica Pond so fascinating, and why, and perhaps a good environment for oysters. What happens, when this cut is opened and closed, when the cut's open and open to the ocean, you get fairly high salinities, kind of like at oceanic level salinity. So this is a plot just showing salinity over time for just this past year, for 2019. And so, when the cut's open, the water level is relatively low in Georgica Pond, and we have high salinities. And then as the cut slowly closes in, we see a little bit of drop in salinity. And then this was the date, actually, the cut was, pretty much closed. But you can see how then the salinity just drops down into these. This year they got, it got down, not super fresh water, but it was down, between 5 and 10. And then when the cut was opened back up in early November, I was shocked at this change, how fast this is literally, the points on here, these are daily average salinities, okay? So this is 2 days, that change in salinity.
You know where that station was?
So this is continuous data from the telemetry buoy, which is at the south part of Georgica Pond, fairly close to that, fairly close to the cut.
South Central.
South, yeah. So you have these low salinities in brackish waters, where oysters thrive in brackish waters, okay? And a big reason for that are these lower salinities are a disease refuge for oysters. One of the major diseases that impact oysters is known as dermo, okay? It's a disease that's devastated oyster populations down south, Gulf of Mexico coming up, and it's a disease that over the last couple of decades has migrated north. And there's a lot of evidence that this is a function of warming ocean temperatures. But it's here, it's been here for a long time. Pretty much every place I've looked, I've found dermo. It's pretty ubiquitous, and it's just a matter of, the oysters trying to outcompete this disease in the environment. So Georgica Pond is a fascinating place. I mean, over the last 20 years, I've grown oysters in over 30 locations in the state. I've grown oysters up the Hudson River, all the way to Tappan Zee Bridge, using similar techniques for this, on Manhattan Island, in Jamaica Bay, Raritan Bay, pretty much every estuary across Long Island and out to the tip of Montauk. And I got to say, Georgica Pond, it's got to be one of the most fascinating places I ever worked in. And it's because of this cut, it's because of these changes in salinities, and it's because I'm so curious to see how oysters are going to respond to this type of environment. So it just, seems like a great place for oysters, and very similarly, just across the town border in Southampton, not too far away in Meatcox Bay. Meatcox Bay is very similar. It also has this ephemeral inlet to the ocean that's opened and closed by the trustees during the year. And these brackish waters and changes in salinities. And Meatcox Bay has the most robust population of oysters on all of South Shore of Long Island, okay? The harvest of oysters that's come out of Meatcox Bay is by far the largest in all the South Shore. Down here, I just made a plot over the last 10 years, okay? This is harvest data from the DEC, and this is the percent of the total oyster harvest from the entire South Shore, going all the way from the west end of Long Island to the east end, the entire South Shore, the percent of oysters harvested. And that's the percent, that's wild oysters and cultured oysters, okay, the percent. I mean, you can see as high as 80% sometimes of all the oysters coming from this little tiny bay, 1,000 acres, okay? And you have your up and down years. Over these last few years here, you see here we are, like at 40%. I got to point out that over these last few years here, aquaculture has been growing in the South Shore. So there's now 4 oyster farms in Mauritius Bay. And then there's the whole islip aquaculture program. I believe there's 13 or 14 farms in that. And that's really been picking up over the last 4 years, which are contributing to the total harvest, okay? So Meatcox oysters were still, harvest was still very high, but the proportion's less because there's more aquacultured oysters coming from the South Shore. the DEC only just started dividing aquaculture harvest from wild harvest, so it's very hard to separate out that data. But as in terms of the percentage of the wild harvest of oysters, Meatcox Bay, if I was to take out the aquacultured oysters out of here, we're up around 80% of wild oysters. So it's a tremendous place, and a lot of it is because of these low salinities, this brackish water, and this inlet. So, you know, when looking at Georgica Pond, I think, you know, for me, the real, I don't know, more interesting question is why isn't there any oysters in Georgica Pond? There isn't any oysters. They're not, the surveys that were mentioned earlier by Brad Peterson's lab and stuff like that, I mean, I've looked around, there are no oysters in Georgica Pond. You know, I don't know if there were ever any oysters in Georgica Pond. I've been trying to look to find historical records on Google search. I haven't been, I would love to ask for the trustees' help on this moving forward. Anything, you know, John, I know in my searches, I came across a PowerPoint presentation on the East Hampton website that gave a fascinating history of aquaculture out east. Do you know what I'm talking about? It looks like the presentation was probably from, I don't know, 10 years ago or something like that, but it gave in fact, I encourage everybody to find it. I'll try to get the link and show you, but it's a great PowerPoint presentation. It's easy to follow. And what struck me, a lot of the issues that are being debated right now, like we heard with the first speaker, and I'm sure we're going to continue hearing through this meeting, these are issues that go back 100 years, you know? I mean, 100 years these debates have been going on. So it really puts things in a historical context, and I love it, but unfortunately it has no information about Georgica Pond, so I don't...
Mike, you probably know, you know, we were asked to try to introduce oysters to Georgica Pond 20-odd years ago, and at that time, those trustees weren't aware of any oysters in the
Okay.
pond before that, but they felt as though, given what you're saying, that Meatcox is so prolific, possibly Georgia could also support an oyster population. We didn't have any success, but I'm
Okay.
hoping your results are better.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because if I hit the button again, previous introduction, it's something I don't know a lot about, and I'd like to learn more about what was done, because I did come across a couple news articles that just kind of said, people have tried to introduce oysters to Georgia Pond in the past, but it didn't work, but with no details. So I don't know, and I do know that you were involved, I guess, in the 80s trying to put some oysters out, but I don't really know any of the details about that either, so I'd like to
Well,
hear more.
Sarah has the report.
Okay.
How does the water differ from Meatcox Bay and Georgica Pond? They're both brackish water bodies. Is there a huge difference? I mean, to have one that's prolific in growth of oysters and then the other, if it's the same body of water, I don't know, the particles in it, how does it differ? Have you made a distinction between the two?
That is the question, and I don't, you know, and that's why I find it so fascinating. Yeah, hope to figure that out. I mean, I could go off a lot on a lot of tangents on why there might not be oysters. I mean, it could just be the seasonal events where salinity gets so low that if there was any oysters in there, it would wipe out the whole population. And then, so I don't know. I mean, maybe really they've never been ever introduced. I find that hard to believe in any types of large numbers to take a I don't know. I don't know the answer, but that's why it's so fascinating, because it really is the perfect environment for oysters, but there isn't any there. So what we decided to do for this phase 1 study in Georgica Pond with oysters is really, it was really basic. It's very simple. I'm going to go through this quickly, but we want to determine if the current water quality conditions can support oyster survival, growth, and reproduction. And to do this, we put oysters in cages so we could exclude predators. We wanted to separate out that variable that could influence survivorship, and we just wanted to focus on water quality and see if they can survive, grow, and reproduce. Also, also very interested in the role and the prevalence and intensity of oyster diseases, and particularly with the relationship between these diseases and dermo and salinity. It's a very fascinating thing to study and to see how oysters are going to respond with these changes in salinity, and whether when these lower salinities actually just could wipe out dermo. So this is a really interesting question. Finally, this is a pilot project. Also have another pilot project very similar going on in Conscience Bay. Conscience Bay is on the north shore. It's similar, it's got a narrow inlet. It's right by Port Jeff Harbor, and it's got a narrow inlet that feeds it. It's open all the time, though, so it's not open and closed, and so it's a more standard bay with a higher salinity. It doesn't have these brackish waters, but also dealing with some water quality issues and asking the same questions and just seeing, just a phase 1 study in Conscience Bay. Same exact techniques, same exact oysters, which I'll talk about. So it's nice, so we can compare, and so if as I'm going to show you just some growth in survivorship, things make more sense when you can compare it to something. So not only am I going to show you the growth in survivorship, I'll compare it to Conscience Bay just to give you an idea of what's going on. So in Georgia Pond, we had 3 study sites. That's the south side here. I think the telemetry buoy is right about here, so it's pretty south. I think it's right down here, the telemetry buoy. And there's our 3 sites. And at each site, we put out 2 size classes or age classes of oysters, okay? The small oysters, which I'm going to call first-year oysters, they were generously provided by town of East Hampton and Barley, thank you, John. They were spawned in early 2019, okay? And as far as stocking densities, and I'll show you the cages in a little bit, but just there's 100 per bag that we started off with, okay? And then the second-year oysters were spawned in 2018. They were initially grown out in Shinnecock Bay, and those we put in 30 per bag. So we have these 2 age classes of oysters. We used experimental enclosures, so pretty much aquaculture-style cages. We put 3 cages per site, okay? This is what the cage looks like. And then inside each cage, we put 2 bags, okay? So it's a standard aquaculture grow-out bag. I basically just cut it in half and boxed it to make 2 boxes. And so in each cage, there'd be a bag of small oysters, a bag of large oysters. So we had everything in triplicate, okay? All right, the minimum replication you want when you're doing a scientific study. So we have everything in triplicate cages. I put a screw-down anchor at each site and then attached the cages along a daisy chain just in case any storms or anything came along, they wouldn't go anywhere. And like I said, they're protected from predators in these cages, particularly the blue crabs. By the way, I've never seen bigger blue crabs in my life. I mean, there was monsters in there. I mean, there was...
Should have seen when we let the pond this year. It's like an exodus.
I'm gonna have a story. Let me just finish this, but a quick story. But also, just the cage, you see they have these legs, and that was important. That elevated the oysters off the bottom. Some of these spots were pretty muddy, and if you put we didn't want the oysters to just get smothered right away in the mud. So it's slightly elevated off the bottom, protected from predators, and very easy to monitor. Just go out there and get the cages. I say easy to monitor, but also nerve-wracking, particularly like in September, when the water level had started coming back up. So the water levels, when I initially put the cages out, I'm going to show you, I was down at my knees. Then it was up here, and I was going out in the water to retrieve the cages, and I'd go out. You can see a couple on their side over here. I would go out, I'd put the cages up, and then I'd reach in to get these bags out. And the bottom bag would be all the way at the bottom of the cage, and so you'd have to reach in far down to get that. And I'm walking out there, and I'm looking at blue crabs, bigger than I've ever seen before, and they love the gear. They love the aquaculture gear. They love to hang on the aquaculture gear. So doing this all blind, lifting the cages up, and then each one reaching my hand in to pull the bags out, I can't tell you how nerve-wracking it was. I still have my hands, so my fingers are all there, so I'm okay. But yeah, some blue crabs there. So so like I said, the cages are all deployed from shore. These pictures were taken in July, okay, when the oysters went out. The water level was pretty low. I mean, it was my first time working in Georgia Pond, so I didn't realize how low this water level would get. I mean, you could see sand here when the water level came up. I mean, God, the water's, you wouldn't see the sand if you all the way up here. So I had to walk out a good distance just to get the cages somewhere where they would just be submerged. I think in the initial proposal that the trustees looked at, I wanted to put oysters at 2 levels in the water column and also have oysters floating at the surface. In this case, it made no sense because there really was just one level. I mean, a floating bag would pretty much be where this cage was. That's how shallow it was. But after the cut closed and the water level came up. Like I said, it did rise up to about here. And then we monitored regularly, especially at the beginning, every 2 weeks, monitored the oysters. In the fall, when the growth slows down, the biofouling slows down, and all that, maybe like once a month. We monitor growth, survivorship, disease, and reproduction. For growth, the smaller oysters, the easiest thing to do, I take a piece of grid paper and put the oysters down, and we take pictures, and then we do image analysis on the computer back at the lab. It can be very quick, and it's a lot more accurate than trying to use a pair of calipers to measure little tiny oysters. So we did that. The bigger oysters, we just measure with calipers right in the field. We count the oysters to get survivorship. We know how many we start with, and so we can calculate survivorship. Each time we got to clean the gear for the fouling, and it was an interesting type of fouling in Georgia Pond. It was kind of some type of slimy, filamentous algae. I don't know if this is an early stage of cladopher or what that is, but anyway, scrub brush, it came right off. So that's something we did each time. So disease, that's a destructive sampling. That was one time at the end in October. I brought samples back to the Marine Disease Lab at Stony Brook, where they're getting analyzed for dermal, as well as a full histopathological analysis for all types of pathologies and diseases, as well as an analysis of the reproductive condition of the gonads. The disease and reproduction analyses are still ongoing. Okay, we'll be doing that, so I'm not really going to be able to talk much about that right now. I'm just going to talk to you about the growth and survivorship very quickly, show you what they did. But so the oysters were deployed before the cut got closed, which was nice because we were able to now, I'm able to come here and say we monitored them through one full cycle of the cut going open, closed, and then back open again. So I'm going to show you data from when they were deployed all the way to the end here. So right off the bat, first of all, survivorship is really high. Okay, they're doing well. For the top plot is the first-year oysters, the small ones. The bottom plot's the second-year oysters. This is just the percent survivorship. Okay, so you start off at 100%, and each of these colored lines is for each of the sites in Georgia Pond. So we had the south, north, and central sites. And the small oysters, we have greater than 80% survival so far through this whole cycle. And the second-year oysters is even better. The bigger oysters are greater than 90% survival. So survivorship is good. To compare it to Conscience Bay, okay? When you look at it, it's like, wow. Conscience Bay, we had a massive die-off of the first-year oysters within the first couple months. Also, significantly higher mortality of the smaller oysters and the larger oysters in Conscience Bay. Really weird. Conscience Bay, like I said, is a more standard bay with the inlet always open at a higher salinity. And there's a native oyster population there, so oysters exist there.
Did you test those for disease?
Yep, tested those for disease. I actually got the early results on the dermo for these. Let me show you the next slide. Okay, so this was a deep spot. Deep, it was 12 feet. I mean, deeper than Georgia Pond. So it was a 12-foot spot. And here I did also put oysters at the surface, okay, in a floating bag, okay? And that's the red line, okay? So that's Conscience Bay in a floating bag is the red line. Conscience Bay on the bottom is the yellow line. Big difference. So when they're at the surface, they did fine. They did tremendous. Down at the bottom, we had this mortality. The early disease results, there was no difference in dermo between the oysters there was no difference in anything between the oysters at the surface and at the bottom. This really suggests it's a dissolved oxygen, and I'm going through the dissolved oxygen data right now, okay? What happens is when you have in deeper waters, usually you get dissolved oxygen levels with decrease at the bottom, okay? So that's where all your dead stuff is going down. That's where the bacteria is doing all the decomposition, and they'll deplete oxygen down at bottom layers. Where up at the surface, where you have wind and mixing, it's usually more oxygen, has more oxygen. And sometimes these low salinity things, we're talking like right at the bottom, really right down near the muds, where I had my cages and where oysters would naturally be.
Do you had chlorophyll readings, top and bottom, for that too?
The chlorophyll readings, top and bottom, are, were periodic measurements that we went and sampled. The continuous reading, we also had a telemetry set up, just like Georgia Pond, with all the continuous data. In the site in Conscience Bay where we were, huge tidal range, like 8 feet. And initially we had this equipment, it's very expensive equipment, set up on the piling and of where we're working. And with these huge tidal ranges, we had the floating dock come up and knock the whole thing off. Fortunately, we did not lose it because it's like a $20,000 piece of equipment. We wound up having to put it on the floating dock. So we have, that reading is kind of close to the bottom, but it's not right at the bottom, and it's going up and down the tide. So that's the chlorophyll, really the main chlorophyll data I had. And it actually was not, the resolution wasn't enough, and I wasn't close enough to the bottom to really see anything with dissolved oxygen. So after this die-off started happening around here, I put dissolved oxygen sensors right on the cages with the oysters. And I haven't gone through that data yet. And I may have missed it, okay? But I really can't think of anything else besides dissolved oxygen to really explain this, given that we've already done the disease testing and stuff like that. Anyway, I thought that was interesting, and I thought it was just very interesting that the survivorship is so much higher in Georgia Pond than Conscience Bay. Again, this is now growth. So you're looking at the same thing, the 3 lines of the 3 sites in Georgia Pond. This is shell height on the y-axis. The top is first-year oysters, the bottom second-year oysters. The oysters grew, too. They went in, they grew. The small ones, which averaged around 13, 14 millimeters when we first put them in, they more than doubled in size from July until, around beginning of October, mid-September. After that, in October, as temperatures go down, the growth kind of just levels off, and so you really don't have much growth at this point. That's why we monitor less frequently at this point.
I have a question.
Yeah, anytime, yeah.
Georgia Pond being closed, does that help the growth as opposed to Conscious Bay, which is open water? And it's open to various different types of temperatures and movement of the energy of the waves and things? Is that a possible reason why Georgia Pond is more prolific?
The next slide. So you're like a slide ahead of me, so I'm going to show you the next slide. But remember, it was the survivorship was higher in Georgia Pond.
Right, and I'm wondering if that's the
Not
reason
growth.
why. They were,
Not
I'm
growth.
sorry, I used the wrong word.
And
Survivorship.
that's why the next slide, there's growth. So even though survivorship was much lower in Conscience Bay, the growth, even for the oysters in the bottom, that yellow line, growth is much, much higher in Conscience Bay.
Okay.
A big part of this likely factor that explains that is salinity, okay? And I've done a lot of experiments. For instance, when I was saying I was up the Hudson River doing a lot of experiments in a wide range of salinities with oysters, and we published a paper a few years back looking at that relationship of growth rates and salinity. And using oysters, again, it was an experimental transplant approach where we took oysters, and those experiments, they were oysters from Fisher's Island hatchery. We put oysters out at these spots, and we pretty much found that at low salinities, growth is a lot slower. Okay, they grow a lot slower. At high salinities, they grow a lot faster. However, there's a trade-off. So you have these slower growth at low salinities, but you also, we found, had no disease. So up in the Hudson River, when we were at these low salinities, there was no dermo. And we had much higher survivorship. And we did these experiments over a couple years. And in the second year, in a lot of the more areas with high salinity, we would see high mortality in the second year caused by dermo, whereas at low salinity. So there's a trade-off at these low salinities. There's a disease refuge, but you have lower growth, okay? That's one thing. The low survivorship, though, in Conscience Bay, I'm pretty sure had to do with dissolved oxygen. That was not a function of disease. That was, because we did the disease testing, there really was no disease. That was just a function.
Higher survivorship in Georgia Pond.
Yes, yeah.
And I'm just wondering if it's protected when it starts to close up.
Right.
Once you open it up, a little salinity comes in, so it's a nice balance.
Right. Yeah,
So maybe we should all grow our oysters at Georgia Pond.
well,
Maybe you should wait for.
it's uncertified and probably not.
Can I tell what you had this year that was somewhat atypical of Georgia Pond is we had let that pond last
Yes.
year towards the end of November. The pond stayed open. In fact, we closed it in order to move the sand after the dredging And then we reopened it, I think it was around the 15th or 20th of March. But the pond was open much, much longer than it normally would. So I think in a more normal year, I think you probably would have had a more hypoxic condition there, and you may not have had the success, the survivability that you
That's,
had there. So are you repeating this experiment next year?
Yes, and that's, you just said exactly why that's important. We really, I mean, 1 year is 1 year, and there's huge interannual variability, and I realized this was, I believe, a record for the cut being open, right, from, it was like April
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
beginning of November, right? So, yeah, it was a pretty long time. Yeah, so and you're right, this might have been an odd year, and that's why we had such success so far. And so anyway, next steps, we're going to continue some data analysis. There's a lot of environmental data to go through, still the disease data. I think when Dr. Kobler presents to you in the spring, I think he usually presents in the spring, you'll have an update on some of that data. And then also next steps for what we'd like to do with the trustees' support and permission moving forward into next year is one, just, continue these cage experiments. So the oysters are still out there. We're going to overwinter the oysters out there at their spots. And basically repeat, right? We're going to do all the monitoring.
Have you checked them to make sure that they're
Yes.
there? Okay.
Yeah, and I'll give you
They're
a story
still-
about that
they're
too,
still there.
quickly.
Yeah, my
Actually, I should have put a couple slides up to show
Yeah.
you some pictures about
My
what
dog
happened.
tried to drag your gear in. She thought she could retrieve
Maggie?
the float that you had on.
Okay,
Yeah, she
Okay.
wasn't successful, but she gave it a real
All right.
college try.
good. Also reproduction, we're going to be looking at in the second year. So the juveniles that we put out are juveniles. They're not reproductive yet, and so we'll see if they get reproductive by next year. The adults we put out, it was in July. It was right in the spawning season, and with them, we're going to see if they're able to re-ripen their gonads and spawn again. So reproduction is also something that we really need to look at in year 2, and then replicate survivorship and growth. But to take to the next step, we'd like to try to deploy some oyster spat on shell in Georgia Pond. So oyster larvae, when they set, they prefer to set on a hard substrate and preferably shell. So a lot of oyster restoration work, we use, the shell's an important component, and we set oysters on this shell. This is a picture of oyster spat on shell in Shinnecock Bay. That's just a few months old in Shinnecock Bay. Underneath all those oysters is a surf clam shell. That's a surf clam shell that we had set, and we've built 4 reefs now using surf clam shell and putting oysters on it. And those oysters now, actually, I've never seen faster growth rates. You would probably think I'm lying if I said that there was a 7.5-inch oyster in a year and a half, but it's true. 7.5-inch.
Wow.
So yeah, and I don't know if that has to do with all the calcium carbonate they have on that shell to suck it up, but so the growth is tremendous. At the same time, then, if we're able to put out spat on shell, also to look at the habitat and how that affects the habitat, positive or negative, and do the monitoring to see how the habitat's affected by the placement of oyster shell.
Now, you're going to be submitting a proposal along those lines?
Yes.
Okay.
So not only, I mean, we will be submitting a proposal. A big if on this is going to be the permitting with the DEC. Just for a little perspective, in the Shinnecock Bay Restoration Program, it took 5 years to get the permits to do the reefs that we're building now, which are about the size of that table. Well, maybe a little bigger than that table, but not that much bigger. So I'm hoping that, that's the reef that we built in Shinnecock Bay are the first permitted restored oyster reefs on Long Island. I'm hoping that now that we've done this process once and gone through it, it might be a little quicker, but we'll have to see how it goes.
What's the objection?
So the objection is, I think the main objection is changing a habitat, altering a habitat. So if you're taking a bottom that's a sand bottom, there may be species that utilize a sand bottom that are not going to be happy if you put shell on it. And so I think that was the concern. And in the end, I think the thing that finally allowed us to do this study in Shinnecock Bay was the exorbitant amount of monitoring that we are doing. And that's what we do. I mean, we do science. So we're doing a lot of science and monitoring on these reefs to really quantify those changes and report that to the DEC and report that to everybody, you know. So I think that's been one of the biggest things, and so it's the tidal wetlands permit. And I think that, and I think, to be honest with you, I think that's, yeah, I think, I'm going to leave it at that, actually. All right. So I think that's it. You know, and of course, I'd like to thank Friends of Georgia Pond, who really have taken the lead on this and really have, well, I wouldn't be standing here right now, right, if it wasn't for Sarah. So Sarah, thank you, and thank you, Friends of Georgia Pond, not just for the leadership in all these projects, but also the generosity of the homeowners around Georgia Pond who have helped fund this research, and the Chapman Perelman Foundation. And then, of course, the commitment of the East Hampton trustees and the town of East Hampton, and the East Hampton Shellfish Hatchery, who's provided the seed for this project and guidance. So, yeah, thank you, everybody, and that's it. And, oh yeah, my last thing is, if you have any questions, you can ask me questions. Good. Or I can sit down.
Thank you very much, Mike.
Thank you, Mike.
Have you considered just free planting oysters and not necessarily oyster on shell, trying to build a reef and see what the survival is there?
So
The only reason I say that is because when we put oysters in the pond 20-odd years ago, it seemed to be the drop in salinity, which was very quick after the gut closed, and what oyster shell we did find had evidence of blue claw predation on it. But we planted them as individual oysters, not necessarily on shell and clustered like that.
Mhm.
Might be interesting to see the difference, if there is a difference.
You know, on the reefs we're building now, basically use bags of, you know, mesh bags to set oyster spat on. So each shell bag's about this big. We use those as building blocks, but we make a 10 by 5 meter rectangle with these things. And it's a living, and it's kind of like a corral. It's a living wall, and we fill the middle with shell. And then I have oysters that grow out that I'll put on top of that shell. So it's a little bit of both. It is spat on shell and loose oysters. The thing, particularly in Georgia Pond and a lot of places, which you have to watch out for, the bottom's muddy. So if we just put loose oysters directly on the bottom, they're gonna spawn. So we have to give some type of elevation, and I think the best way to do that, or the most natural way to do that, is with shell. If we can build up shell, and then you're also providing a substrate if there is ever recruitment. That oysters could then, you're creating a habitat that oysters could recruit on. So we need something to elevate above the bottom.
Where do you get your shells, Mike?
Yeah, so we primarily use surf clam shell. You know, surf clam is a very big fishery in New York, so it's New York shell. And with surf clam, those are the bigger, more offshore clams that are primarily used for like canned clams and chowders and stuff like that. So they get shucked. And you literally get truckloads of shell that go to the landfill or wherever they go, the incinerator, the landfill. So yeah, so we just bought some of that, you know, and it's a big, you know, we got, I mean, God, I can't even tell you how many yards upon yards of this shell we got. And it's a big stinky mess when we get it. You know, we have a pile on the Southampton campus, so there's a lot of still meat in the shell and stuff like that, and then it's going to be covered in maggots for like a good couple months, and we let that cook down, and then after about a year, it's ready to go. And then it gets power washed clean. We literally power wash the shell and package it, make it nice and clean for the oyster spat to set on, and that's what we've been using. We also started a couple years ago a shell recycling program. We're kind of slowly getting that off, and there's a lot of shell recycling programs now that are popping up around Long Island too. So.
We tried to do that here in a small, very small way.
It was a place to stockpile that stinking shell
Yeah.
that tripped us up.
Yeah. Fortunately, we have a campus on Southampton with a lot of empty space that nobody's around. So, yeah. All right. Thank you.
Great,
Thank you very much, Mike. Very informative.
Mike, if you want, grab some honey.
Oh, yes.
Best honey, I have to say. Thank you very much. That was very informative. Appreciate it.
Okay, Billy, you're up.
I thought I'd be here all night, just past my bedtime.
No.
Evening, guys.
Please introduce yourself.
Yeah, I will. I'm Billy Schultz. I'm an 83-year-old bayman from Springs. I am not as busy on the water as I used to be, and I'm not attending these meetings like I used to. But I've run into a few frustrated baymen lately who are upset a little bit of they feel they're not being listened to by people at different, I'm not speaking, sorry, at different levels of local government or government. So I also know from while watching the TV of these meetings that there's a lot of controversy about the leases in Devon Promised Land area. Navigational issues, lawsuits, homeowners from Louse Point to Lazy Point objecting to the site of the floating cages. In that area, I would also like to add that for the last 4 or 5 years, there's been some worthwhile scallop harvest there. Been doing pretty well, getting some limits on in the beginning of it. And this site selection, or the site selection for these leases was not supposed to interfere with scallop harvesting. The reason I'm here is to discuss the proposal by Barley Dunn and supported by John Aldred to open the Northwest Harbor to scallop. My understanding that Northwest Harbor was left out of the selection in 2010 because of a conflict or possible conflict with scalloping, the use of scalloping. And also since 2010, there's been a large increase in boat traffic and recreational usage in this area. And the Northwest Homeowners Alliance has voiced their objections to this also. And Charlie Nichols, I don't know if you guys all know Charlie, but he's a member of the, he's a person on the FAC in town. And he was coming home from Maine tonight, and he talked to me. He said that the FAC had a meeting not too long ago, and that it was his understanding, it wasn't really, I don't know if it was really voiced to him, that David Lees and also Supervisor Pete do not seem to be in support of this proposal to go up to Northwest. I don't know if that's exactly true or not. It was told to me today. The reason I'm here really is to talk about the economics of this issue here in Northwest Harbor. Northwest Harbor is one of the most productive bay scallop grounds in the Northeast. In 1982, somebody told me to count the boats. I don't know how they had time to count them, but they did if they were scalloping. In 1982, there were about 300 boats out there scalloping. That's 450 baymen, figured somewhere 2 people in a boat. And then that relates into openers and buyers and people that will spend the money locally. Good Christmases for the family. Northwest Harbor is a big economical benefit to Long Island as a whole, and not just to a few individuals or a company growing oysters. This is public bottom and should not be leased to private business. I've been up there scalloping and clamming for 61 years, and there are families, one of my bayman friends from Shelter Island was supposed to be here tonight, who have been working these waters for over 5 generations, one family. It's also been shown at some digs, archaeological digs, that the Indians were harvesting shellfish there for hundreds of years. And we are newcomers and would like to continue that harvest there. What did I write there? Oh, you never know when or where a shellfish crop will set. I mean, they seem to be set where they feel like, and they set sometimes pretty thick in a small area. So we don't really like to be shut out of any bottom. It could be that's where they set that particular year. And this is New York State water, and we have scalloped alongside baymen from all over Long Island, Southampton, Shelter Island, all in North Fork, and as far west as some from Babylon when there was a big crop up there. And I don't think they would like to be happy to lose any access to this, to these scallop grounds. I talked to the DEC, Soren Dahl, I don't know him, and he said, quote, "We were surprised by the proposal to scalp by barley. I guess they didn't expect that to be a proposal to open up Northwest. And I talked to Susan Filipowicz from Scalp, and she seems to think that she has to find a home for these leases. Well, it might not be feasible out here, but maybe it is. But I think Northwest is definitely in proper place. In conclusion, I would like to say that this proposal is a poorly thought out and ill-conceived idea. Any leases in Northwest Harbor would be detrimental to the economy of many individuals and communities on the East End. Also, please remember your duties as trustees is to protect the use of land, water, and bottomland for the good and benefit of all, not just for a few individuals. I know that you are not the deciding board on this situation, but I ask you to let Scalp, or whatever it is, Scalp, know that you do not support this proposal. Thank you.
Thank you, Billy.
Billy, if I could just,
Yeah, I may not have everything right, but
if I could just sort of address this issue of proposal.
okay.
I didn't intend this to be a proposal. What we were reacting to was the problems that seem to have cropped up in Devon, Promised Land area.
Mhm.
And in meeting with those people, it seemed as though one possible solution to their dilemma was to maybe find some places, other places in town to relocate some of the lease sites.
Yes.
We met with the Fisheries Advisory Committee. It was a relatively small group that day. This was a long time ago, last summer or possibly even spring. And, you know, our point was not to necessarily take anything off the table, just to look at the town as a whole and meet with the various groups to see what reactions we would get. And that's the spirit in which I at least approached the Northwest people. We also talked about that Northwest at that Fisheries Advisory Committee meeting. The reaction was much the same as yours is now. We talked about Cherry Harbor, we talked about Hedges Banks, different places in town. So Barley and I are not really making proposals, although I guess you can interpret it that way if you
I
want.
think somebody used that word once to me, so that's.
I've heard the word
Yeah.
used several times, many times. But the intent is just to look at the town in general, to see if there is another area that or areas that some of these leases can be relocated to alleviate the pressure that's coming from Promised Land. That's it, all right? So that's.
Yeah, I understand that, John. But I don't think this is a Northwest Harbor is the solution to that other issue. I mean, I think it's just a heavily used small harbor that has a lot of, I mean, when things are right there, there's a lot of money and people are busy and money comes into the community and they don't want to lose any areas.
Yeah, we're hearing the same thing from practically every part of town that we've.
Well, some of it's, this is a little different objection. It's based on economics more than looking at floating cages. Anyway, and when you're up there scouting, you can't put up with either floating cages or sunken ones because you just can't go in the area anyway, either way. And I've scalloped up there all the way from Cedar Point, the channel runs Cedar Point to Sarah Harbor. We've scalloped all the way from there to every beach. I mean, you never know. I mean, we've covered every bit of ground, and the ground that you might lease out would be this year's little spot that is loaded. You know, I mean, you know that from shellfish, they get little pockets and stuff like that.
And as you say, you're seeing them in Devon area too.
Well, they've been down here, Andy just left, he had to get home. He was down there with his father, Doug. They had, not this year, but I went down once. I'm getting too old to do this work, but they had like one day 17 bushel down there a few years ago. And they're a little concerned about that with the leases too down there if they keep further producing them.
Well, unfortunately for aquaculture, an aquaculturist needs a place.
I know. I don't know if the place is in East Hampton. That's what I told Susan. I guess that was the name, yeah. It may not be here, place. Maybe he has to go up into Peconic more. You got draggers here, you got gill netters, you got recreational use. We've been out of Peconics for years. There's been no dragging up there since I don't know when they outlawed it. We used to gill net all the way up to, I used to go with Francis's uncle. We used to go up Jessup's. That's no gill netting up there anymore. I don't know, I don't want to put my mouth up there with the baymen that work up in that area, but I don't know. Okay, guys?
Okay, thanks, Billy.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Billy, thank you very much.
Hey, Bill, grab some honey.
He told me if I couldn't do it.
Okay,
Thanks for coming.
Bart Burke?
I didn't realize what that list was, I thought it was just a...
Okay. Adam Yanis?
John Parker. Where's John Parker?
So, is this good? Everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. So I just want to start and say thank
Just
you.
introduce yourself, please.
Oh, my name is Adam Eunice. I'll be just, so just want to say thank you to the trustees for listening. Mike Dole, it was nice to hear some refreshing facts about oysters. And I only have 15 letters, so I'll start reading them now, but just kidding. I think after hearing Ms. Priori talk and listening to other recorded audio from these meetings, a lot of what people are talking about can be described really as NIMBY and not in my backyard. And it seems that a lot of individuals do want to see aquaculture in their backyard, whether that's floating or whether that's a sunken cage. Because when you have a sunken cage, then you're going to have a float at the top. So that would then become a target for unsightly buoys. So this argument of NIMBY is being disguised as navigation hazards and basically scare tactics, as I would describe. I started this farm out in Napeague, or Gardeners Bay, 4 years ago, and have chosen to use floating gear because it is a much better way of, without going into details, of growing oysters without suffering mortality and other things. I would also like to point out, and other speakers from other meetings, that these sites that are in Gardeners Bay and that are using floating gear are lit, they have lit corner buoys. And the sites are on the NOAA maps. So if you are a responsible boater, then, and you are looking at a map, you'll see that it's there. You can't just go out at night without a radar or something like that and expect everything to be fine. I've also arranged my farm in such a way, with all of the pushback, to allow as much space in between each one of my grow lines for people to pass through when they're coming upon the site. And I've, on numerous occasions, watched sailboaters from Devens leave Devens and go straight through the farm. In terms of location in Gardeners Bay, yes, it is an open bay, everybody knows that, but it has extremely clean water, and it is a huge selling point for me when I go to restaurants. I can say that this comes from a place where the water is clean, as if you were to go into the further west, you don't necessarily have that type of water quality. The wave action there, yes, it can be more robust than in other places, but that actually shapes the shell and makes my job a little bit easier. In previous meetings, Peter Mendelman talked about my cages being like rocks, and it's just a lie. They're not rocks, they're floating cages, and if your boat hits them, they're going to move out of the way. And if you're paying attention, as a responsible boater should, then you won't hit them. There are, and he showed pictures of one of my cages washed up from 2 years ago, and that problem that I had with 2 cages washing up, I fixed it. Didn't happen this year, but no one brings that up, so I needed to bring that up, that this problem has been, of 2 cages coming loose, has been fixed.
Adam, which lease site do you have?
I believe my number is
541.
841.
841.
Yeah, so I'm tucked away from the prevailing winds in the summer, which is when you're doing most of your work. There in the southwest corner. And lastly, I would just like to say that the floating gear is also, bottom gear is great habitat, and so is the floating gear. It's actually a honey hole for fishing. There are scup there are striped bass there, and everything in between. So there is really nothing bad going on out there. It is just NIMBY individuals who do not want to see floating gear.
Well, do you think that sinking floating gear is a compromise for this?
Sinking and floating?
No, sinking the gear is a compromise to the...
I don't, because it's maybe a combination of both, but I think that as a farmer, I would like to have as many tools in my shed.
Sure, but the only difference here is you're not a farmer in the sense of a farmer that owns his land and is farming his land. You're conducting your activity on public land, so I think to be fair, there's got to be some give and take here a little bit. That a luxury that you would have if, let's say, you're working off of bottom land that either holds a long lease or you own that bottom land or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, the land is, legally leased, and I went through all of the process to obtain that lease. And I've followed all of the rules. I'm not doing anything wrong, and if I thought I was putting anybody in danger, I would not do it. But with the boat traffic that's out there, which is very, very little, because most of it comes out of 3 Mile and it goes down, and they don't go down into, unless you're going to Devon's or a private house down there, and there's not very much good fishing down there. So I have incorporated, instead of putting out more floating gear, I have tried putting out bottom gear. And the way that the animals grow at the bottom is basically like a fingernail. They're flat, they have no shape to them, and they suffer higher mortalities. So I'm hesitant to take my farm and put it on the bottom so that people don't have to see it.
How much higher mortality do you think?
So I didn't do any statistics on it, but I would say compared to what's at the surface, at least 50%. Yeah, I don't see any mortality at the surface unless I've done something wrong.
Are you required to keep any insurance on your farm?
I'm not required to keep any insurance, no. But I'm, boaters, most boaters have, I guess their liability insurance of some sort.
So you have it on your vessel, but not your farm?
That is correct.
It's an issue that's been brought before the committee several times.
Yeah, I've heard it before in the videos. I know Peter mentioned making sure that all of his parking spots, all of those boats have liability insurance.
Can you talk about the economics a little bit? How many people like yourself are actively using these lease sites? I mean, you're on the water a lot, I assume. Can you name on one hand, is it 5 or 10 guys? Is this a full-time career?
Are you talking in East Hampton?
Yeah, in East Hampton.
In East Hampton, there are 3 of us, and there's 1 more coming through the pipeline, I believe. And yes, I went to school for aquaculture, and I do believe that this is a viable way to make a living, especially in a town like this that was founded on farming and fishing.
How many active farms are there now? I know, I've seen your stuff out there. I didn't see much else this year.
So Bob, Mr. Valenti is off and on, depending on what he wants to do. And then, so he wasn't out here this year, but last year he was, I believe. And then Frank will hopefully be getting his farm up and running. But there aren't too many active farms.
I do a lot of traveling on the South Channel route that you described, and quite a bit at night to go fishing. And I never noticed anything lit in the area of your farm.
They are there. They
So-
are there.
so
They're
they're-
expensive lights on top of expensive buoys.
Are they white lights, or are they what color lights are they?
They are yellow lights, and they are steady.
It's a solid,
It's a solid,
Solid
yeah,
beacon,
there's
so to
not,
speak.
Peter mentioned something about green and having channel markers, but you're not trying to channel anybody into this.
Fusion.
Yeah, exactly, so,
We're required to keep the same yellow buoys by the Shellfish Hatcheries field site in that Peak Harbor. It's a standard Coast Guard color for our.
yeah, it represents aquaculture, and then the steady light. I'm not sure what that represents.
right. So have you been approached to potentially move your site to the other side of the bay? Is that something that you are talking to people about or considering?
It has been broached once by Kurt, but I have no intention of moving to another place and spending 3 years figuring out how to farm on that site. It takes time to figure out each site, and if I were to move half a mile away across on the other side of the bay, there's a learning curve involved with that. There's a money curve involved with that. And I'm happy where I am. My product is selling well, people like it, and everything is going well except for this NIMBY. I do not have any further comments, but I don't mind taking more questions. No?
Thank you, Adam.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Adam, you want some honey, go ahead and take some.
I appreciate that, thank you.
Great.
Thank you.
Was it Sam? Is it,
Oh, that was just a roll sheet, sorry.
you don't want to talk?
Not tonight, thank you though.
I'd just like to make a comment about these maps. These maps were given out at the last Scout meeting on the 20th. And Scalp has requested comments be returned on the maps by the end of this month. The maps are a distillation of all the comments that the program received in all the forums that they held, beginning with the one we had here in January, They had one in every town. They had focus groups for the various interests, boating, aquaculturists. All the comments received in all those forums were distilled by the consultants working on the SCAL program and put into these maps. All they've asked for are for people to look at the maps, make sure that what their comments were and presented to the program are accurately portrayed on the maps, and to get back to them by the end of the month with those comments. The next meeting of SCALP will be probably in the late January timeframe. And my understanding is they won't really be addressing the location of leases until sometime for the future, until sometime in the February timeframe. So this board hasn't really, I mean, the maps have been available. I know that at the last meeting that I wasn't at, the information was given out that on the web, that they were available on the SCALP website. I was able to bring hard copies into the office a few days ago. They'll stay in the office, so if any trustees want to take a look at them and individually make comments on what's on the maps presented to the county, any individual is welcome to do that. And hopefully the trustees will have an opportunity to discuss these issues as a board sometime in January after the new board convenes. That's the way I see it.
Thank you, John.
They're very impressive maps, too, so we're,
Is there anybody else?
Yeah,
on the
John
board?
Parker?
just want to say, everybody knows where our office is located if you want to come and see the maps? Yes? Okay.
John Parker, I'm a resident of Sag Harbor. I'm also on the Harbor Committee in Sag Harbor, and several other committees, but I'm not speaking for the village on this. There's not much that I can say that hasn't already been said today, so I'm going to try not to repeat it. But in regards to scalp, I mean, I'm concerned about the hazards to navigation. I have in other areas in the Meatcox Bay and estuary come across the floating cages, and it's a situation where, you know, being an old guy now, I'm going to places I've been going to for 50 or 60 years, and suddenly there's a floating hazard to navigation there, and the ones I've seen aren't lit. And you can imagine a night like tonight, you know, trying to navigate, you know, through them. Even if there's a light on one end, it's you know, you're not going to know where the rest of it or all of them are. And I can recall suddenly, like, you know, I'm in the middle of floating cages, and so I think that's an issue. Northwest Harbor is and down to Sag Harbor is in the middle of the summer. The amount of traffic of every type there is just amazing. And I will add one thing that hasn't been mentioned: seaplanes. I don't know how seaplanes are gonna see them. We worry about this already in terms of their landing and mixed with other with moorings and boats and water skiers and sailors, and you know, I could bring in pictures of seaplanes landing in the middle of mooring fields and in front of sailboat races and that kind of thing, and I have before, but I won't repeat that. But we have traffic we have tenders, yacht tenders, that are 30, 35 feet with 3 or 4 400 horsepower outboards. And you can imagine the speeds, and we see them go across the bay at night. We're just trying to eliminate hazards rather than, you know, increase them. So I just hope that's considered. There is concern in terms of that the leases do give an exclusive right, basically, to an area for use of that area, which excludes other people or other activities that that many of us, you know, have thought we could continue for, you know, for a lifetime in that area. And you know, you have commercial water skiing going on, which actually we've moved up more towards Cedar Point, has moved up in that area because it's too congested down by Sag Harbor, you know, to do it. So they're now going up to Barcelona and going around to Little Northwest Harbor, Northwest Creek, and up toward Barcelona. So I mean, it's just the traffic is you know, on a Saturday or Sunday in midsummer, it's you know, it's getting out of hand already, and just to keep that in mind. You know, we look to the trustees to safeguard the uses of the waters and the lands, and it's part of the public trust doctrine that goes back to the Magna Carta and was transferred to the trustees by the Dongan Patents, as you're well familiar with. So I trust that you'll look out for that, you know, for us. Rick asked me to mention while I was here where we were with the waterway law in the village. And on that, I can speak as a member of the Harbor Committee and for the village. It was exactly 4 years ago that I first appeared here in regards to the expanded jurisdiction, and which resulted in discussing a new waterway law for the expanded area that we, you know, negotiated. And I'm not going to give a presentation on that today, and I'm going to be very brief. To some extent, we're starting over. We have a new administration. A new mayor, and she wants to take a new look at it, a new fresh look at it. We started last week. We're continuing this week, and the Harbor Committee is going to look at, go back and look at its original recommendations from almost 3 years ago, which we made in consultation with the trustees, and we had a subcommittee of trustees, and Rick and I think Jim, you know, were on that. We met with myself and John Shaka, who is now in London, so he's not participating. But we'll continue that and go back to that. You'll have an opportunity for input. There are new attorneys involved. Fred Thiel is our Harbor Committee attorney now. Working with him and meeting with him on some of the issues later in the week. Hope to work with you on it.
Listen, maybe we can get together in the new year with Jim and I and
Sure.
restart the process.
Sure, but we want a little time for the village to look at it again first. I think we got a little bit off track, you know, on some things earlier in the year, and a lot of changes were made, and we want to look back to some of the original recommendations and then work out from there. So we're working on it.
Okay. Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Thanks, John.
Oh, excuse me. I'll mention one other thing. And while I was sitting there regarding oysters, I thought of something. One of the things you're working on for us, and we're very happy that you are, is Little Northwest Creek and the possible dredging there. And the issue was the outlet of the creek having moved about 1,000 feet to the west and creating problems. Well, when we were talking about oysters, my recollection was that I remember when I was a kid, there was an oyster bank there. It was a much deeper channel, and along the eastern side of it, there were oysters. That's my recollection from 60 or more years ago. But the thought was that probably stabilized the location of the outlet.
Interesting. Well, there's your expert right next to you, John.
Hey, John, if you want to grab some honey, go ahead. And Joan,
It's good for any upcoming colds, Joan.
Could you give that John and Joan?
Yeah.
Yeah, you grab it.
Oh, we have.
Yeah, you were going to the bathroom.
Can I say something?
Is everybody that wanted to, because Joan, you'd be glad to let you talk, but is everybody that wanted to talk about the oyster or the scalp program had an opportunity to speak? If there's anybody else here that wanted to say something about that? Okay, Joan, go
Could I
ahead.
just say one thing, Joan, also? This isn't a public hearing. We're just taking comments from the public as we do every meeting.
I just want to say something about John and Barley, because I think a lot of people think.
But
Come on
Joan,
up to the
you come
lectern.
on up to the,
I think that a lot of people are under the impression that John and Barley are supposed to decide this. And that's not really being fair to them, because they're not the people who are deciding it. They are the people who are going to hear what the trustees and the town board say, and then they're going to report that to Scalp. So that they're not the deciders, they're the messengers.
Thank you. Okay, Michael Mahoney?
I'm not here to talk about Scalp. I happen to love them. I'm a happy end user. I'll miss them if they're ever gone. I wanted to talk to you briefly as the trustees regarding Wainscott Beach, Beach Lane, and Deepwater, as you're well aware of. I've stumbled upon that you're having a special meeting on Wednesday, and that's fine. And then I also heard that there was something involving real estate, and that's fine. And then I heard Deepwater was mentioned. So, with that being said, I just have to get this off my chest so I can sleep at night. I want to hope and pray that you guys take no action, and Lady Susan, regarding any sort of a commitment to Deepwater, Eversource, until after they've completed their Article 7 review. Make no commitment that you're going to give them access to the beach. They need to vet out the other possible landing sites. They need to compare them. When I looked at the latest update on the layout, the COPD for Beach Lane, they've got their drill sitting in the middle of the street next to my neighbor's house. And they show a lane open, but if you look at it, the only way that that lane's open is if you're driving on the grass on the median there. They have double trailers going up and down. This is a street that's used year-round, especially during the summer, for children, for bicycles, people walking, but it's also used in September and October, less so now in November, December, January, but it'll pick up again in March. I'd like to see, before anybody commits to anything regarding the cable landing, the other site vetted out and a good evaluation made. I am adamantly opposed to digging up 27. Makes no sense. I can't justify that for all the tea in China.
Thank you.
I agree completely. I'm not opposed to wind power. I'm for wind power. It's great. And we've heard the term NIMBYism, and I'll pick on Frank Deline. He used that term once on me, and I said, you know, Frank, it's not that it's in my backyard. It happens to be. But I look at the size of the work site available at Heather Hills versus Beach Lane. I'm thinking of the safety of the workers as well as the public. I'm thinking of the access of the emergency vehicles. Heather Hills, what I've been told, what I see, its biggest obstacle is going to go through some wetlands. And that's not a good thing. But it's a small incursion, and they can resolve that. The DEP, or whichever one the girl mentioned, they're used to dealing with it. So I just want to say strongly, please don't make any decisions regarding any sort of a commitment to our beach until after they have fully vetted out the possible landing sites. Then, just to close on a big positive note, somebody sends me a notice today that Governor Cuomo passed an act a long time ago regarding developers maintain public website to disclose the names of all municipal officers, their relatives who are a financial stake in the wind farm development. Article 10, reestablish comprehensive centralized process. Article 10, there, allowing limited Turner's office promotes sustainable growth in wind. Deepwater, Ørsted, didn't sign that, is what I'm told. Other places, other wind companies have. So I think we should at least require them to go by the regulations that we have in place. And if they're not doing that, that troubles me. I hope it troubles you. I hope it troubles the town.
Could you just clarify what they were supposed to do that they did not do? I'm sorry, I didn't.
They're required, any of these wind developers are required to sign an agreement that they are, should give this to your attorney. truly to find remains in fact signature there to mandate all wind easements and define the plan goes as follows must plan. Give me a moment. I hate public speaking. The revised code prohibits wind development companies from providing public officials with improper benefits, including monetary gifts or employment opportunities, and mandates the public disclosures of wind easements and leases. The original Code of Conduct for Wind Development, the code, was released in 2008 with the Attorney General's office, led by former Attorney General Andrew Cuomo. Wind farm developers had bribed or intimidated municipal officials to approve wind projects shortly after the code's inception. Two major changes in New York wind development landscape caused the code to become both outdated and unused. The Power Act of 2011, Article 10 of the New York established a comprehensive centralized process review board for repowered existing electrical facilities of 25 megawatts or greater. I'm happy to leave this with you. It's something I...
Michael, is there a code for that particular passage, or where can we find it?
I'm the wrong person to ask that.
No, I know, but
This
I'm
was
just
passed
wondering,
to me.
'cause I'd like to look it up, the code.
Yeah, if you could leave it with our attorney, that'd be great.
Thank you.
So some form of disclosure of paying for approvals or something to that effect?
Basically said that...
Bribery or...
You don't quite use that terminology.
As I read it, the layperson that I am, public officials couldn't be employed by them, and that there couldn't be monetary inducements to municipalities for getting approval. Then, you know, we're told we're getting an $8.5 million community benefit.
Actually, that's a requirement. Okay, that's a requirement on any of these projects, whether it be wind, whether it be solar, even a natural gas plant. Okay, the host community, the Public Service Commission requires the host community to or the developer to provide the host community a benefits package above and beyond the mitigation costs, okay?
That's wonderful, and I accept that. I'm not going to argue with that at all.
Also, this board has hired
You've got an excellent
outstanding attorney
Yeah.
to advise us on every step,
Yep.
and everything is totally
You guys have an excellent attorney. I've
legal.
met her. I enjoy what you guys have done. I appreciate what you've done. I'm not here to criticize you. I'm just hoping that you're not going to make a commitment until after they finish the Article 7 review of any way, shape, size, or form, and I hope that that will also wind up with the alternatives being reviewed and looked at equally. I think Heather Hills is a more safer place for this cable to land.
Well,
that's my opinion.
Okay, but I want to just take a moment on this. I listened to the arguments against Beach Lane and the encumbrance of traffic and that. I live in Montauk, okay? I'm in the fire department in Montauk. I know how many ambulance calls that we run each and every year. And I lived in Montauk my whole life. So when comments were made by the Wayne Scott community's attorneys about how the lines were buried, you know, some 30 years ago, it didn't close down traffic or anything else. Yes, they were buried. They were done with a plow. They were not buried to spec. We have a different traffic situation now than what we had 30 years ago. And even if you did this in the middle of the winter, okay, to traverse that distance between Hither Hills and the end of 27, you're not talking about a period of weeks. It's closer to months and probably the better part of a year to get across that peak stretch. Okay, that impacts a much larger portion of this community than, let's say, Beach Lane. But I did hear the hybrid solution, which was offered towards the end of that last settlement hearing, which...
That I wasn't supposed to be able to talk about, and I wasn't trying to talk
Which,
about.
I mean, seemed like it had some merits as compromise. I did discuss that with Orsted's counsel and some of their engineering team, And they claim that there's some real problems with that, but I understand that Thursday, there is another settlement hearing on Thursday, which I think
Friday.
is, or
Friday.
Friday, to discuss, revisit the alternatives again, so.
I respect and I agree. As I said, I do not think 27 should be dug up in any way, shape, size, or form. And I don't see that it needs to be, but I am not them, I am not the engineer. I'm not able to make that deduction. All I want them to do is to evaluate it and see if there is a way feasibly to do that. People throw out at me that Wainscott didn't object to the water being installed. Of course not, our water was contaminated. But at the same token, they didn't have to do any trenching. And the traffic, commercial traffic, the emergency services flowing on 27, I'd like to see that improved, not worsened, and I don't want to see a project that's going to make that worse. I don't see any reason to make 27 be interrupted. I believe that that power can be brought ashore. My own little thought in my own little small mind. Let's get LIPA to sit down and negotiate back with Ørsted Eversource and run a 69 kilovolt cable out to the Amagansett substation. Aerial, because already they've got the aerial cables going out there. And if they need to put up a stronger pole or a monopole, then go ahead and do that. You're going to get more power delivered to the substation. They can run with that power anywhere that they want. That's my own thought.
Well, I'm sure there's going to be a bunch of people that have an issue with that, too.
I'm sure of that.
Anyway.
I wanted to come up and say, please, so that I could sleep.
Okay.
You don't have to
Glad you
worry
came.
about anything happening Wednesday, I promise you.
I like your sweater.
Well, thank you. My wife dresses me. She buys all my clothes since we got married.
How about some honey?
Yeah, there you go.
I've had,
We'll sweeten the
This is
night.
delicious.
There you go. It's great honey. It's the best.
Homemade Jim.
Steve Borner. Thank you.
Steve?
Trustees, really quickly, on this article is a 2016 article regarding code of conduct for wind farm and wind energy companies, and that in the event any municipal officers have any financial stake in any energy companies, then these companies are required by the New York State Code of Conduct to disclose that in the form of a website. So that's kind of what this article is referring to. So if anybody has any financial stake in it, then it needs to be disclosed on their website.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris.
doesn't it also state that the wind company is supposed to sign an agreement that they will do that?
I don't see that here, but
Not
Keep-
there. Not
keep reading.
Not there, but I think when you get the regulation there.
thank you.
Have a good evening.
Thank you,
Good
Michael.
night. Thanks.
Thank you.
Steve.
Greetings, everyone. Happy 333rd anniversary of the Dongan patent. Did you know that? Today.
333 years?
It's not today, is it? It's a
Intended
couple days.
consequences at its best.
It's today?
Today's today.
Today's the
I
day.
looked at
Okay,
the,
happy birthday.
Happy
yeah,
birthday.
happy birthday.
There are
Thank you
cookies
for
here,
bringing that
cookies.
historical fact to
I
us.
actually looked at the original
I knew it was a
over 2 hours ago.
33rd.
Investigated it. It's in good shape and safe.
All right, so this is the perfect night for you to be here.
I have it in my pocket, actually. So I'll just ask to give an update on my ongoing investigation with Northwest area with Rick Whalen. And I'm up to my waist, all things Northwest, cartographic records, written instruments, deeds, general histories, legal, everything, you name it. And I'll have a big report for you all to read. But if you have any questions right now, I've got many balls in the air. I meet with Rick Whalen regularly to go over everything. But I'm looking at different parcels and have it backward and forward from the very beginning. I'm doing a historical geographic reconstruction, a map of that whole vicinity and ownership, and all the way to present day and backwards, because there's some conflicting information about who owned what and how that carried forward as far as title. So,
Steve, there is one property that we are working on, Little Northwest Creek. Did you come to any conclusions on that as a starting point?
I felt all along, and for a long time, even before all this, and I still feel it based on my research, that it's trustee-owned.
Okay,
It's
thank
an inland creek, and I've personally indexed and handled hundreds, if not thousands, of deeds, a few thousand for that area, and all of East Hampton, all those creeks, those deeds from the very beginning, whether they were, well, they originally proprietor divisions and closures, those allotments, they're always bounded by the creek or the harbor, always. Anything bounded by a bay is the beach, never to the bay. And anything bounded by the ocean is always to the beach, never the mean high water Atlantic Ocean. It's that simple. If there's anything contrary, I'm skeptical of it.
So, Steve, if you look at it now, that creek is cut in half by DEC on one side, New York State on the other side. Have you found any records of that being absorbed for parkland? By Little Northwest Creek. If you look at it on a map, there's a line directly down the middle. One side is owned by the DEC, one side says New York State. Have you seen any records of transfer or any records of them trying to absorb it somehow?
Well, if it does this conversation any good, we did have a meeting, Drew Bennett and I, with the DEC the other day, where we represented ourselves as the owners of Northwest Creek, and nobody was arguing that point, so,
Little Northwest, you mean?
or Little Northwest Creek. Nobody was arguing, you know, the DEC, whether they didn't pick up on that part of the discussion, but nobody challenged that or in any way made any claims otherwise.
Would be on them.
So is there any point during this investigation where we will have an opportunity to change these maps to show the ownership being trustees?
Change the map?
Yeah.
That's, I sure hope so.
Okay.
If you look at Suffolk County real
Could you
property.
go back to the podium? So you can speak into the mic.
If you look at the Suffolk County real property tax map, it shows state ownership. So, you know, I've always said this, I don't trust maps. So I think we'd be better off making our own, which is what I'm working on, and then sitting down with the right government agencies and proving it factually. As you know, I'm very methodical and careful with these, like Gardens Island investigation, and I want to make sure everything is ironclad. But I'm trying to get my hands on all sorts of surveys, Suffolk County and New York State. But to answer your question, to me, there's no question. Those creeks and harbors are trustee-owned.
So you're looking at transfer records or any deed transfers or anything up till the present day? How far have you gotten in that area, Little Northwest Creek area, to the present day? I'm hearing you sort of talking about, historical ownerships and stuff. Have you gotten closer to the present day on
Working
it?
backwards and forward. So,
You could speak into the mic, please.
sorry. I'm working backwards and forward, because as I said, I've seen discussions of transfers like the Monk's estate in probably the 19-teens or 20s, and I'm skeptical of the claims of that, what they owned, saying that beaches and so forth. So there's some gaps, but I'm connecting them all. And that's coming from a variety of sources. As you know, a lot of these deeds aren't recorded, so I have to look at everything. But the general rule is deeds are always bounded by these bodies of water. So why the trustees would ever convey these bodies of water wouldn't make any sense to me.
Steve, and to Jim's question, or to Francis's rather, with the map being divided, Northwest Creek, half of it is owned by the state, half of it is owned by
DEC.
the DEC. There's no documentation as of yet that proves that the trustees have lost that property, so who is claiming, I mean, how do they claim these things unless they've gone through a deed transfer? And you haven't come upon that, right? So how does the state just suddenly say, we own this, and the DEC says we own that?
Well, another
Well,
example
the
is...
cartographer doesn't know who owns it and just conveniently draws the line in the middle and
Okay,
says
but
if
but
anybody
another prime
contests.
example down there is Northwest Creek, where the county claims ownership of
And a sign's there,
large
so how do
portion of
they
that.
legitimately put up a sign that says that they own it if they don't?
I thought that was a deal between the trustees and the county for dredging the inlet.
I'm just that, because I haven't seen it. Not that I've done the deep dive as Steve has done,
Now,
but
that's another area, John, that we're looking to clarify, so that's on the docket. And Steve was originally, I think, gonna go from west to east, but Little Northwest Creek as a project.
see, I was always under the understanding that if land is owned by the public or a municipality, that it can't be absorbed by another municipality or public entity. So down there, we have exactly that. And I'm just very curious to know how
So
that...
they just absorb
How that,
because,
when they created the park, somehow that got drawn, became a part of it, and I don't understand how that can be.
Consider that like eminent domain.
I was just gonna say that. But
Please
how do they,
But it's
without
already
notifying the
public
town
land.
or the trustees?
It's already public land.
Sonia,
So,
these
anyway.
are all the
but-
questions that you're working on, right?
Like I said,
But eminent domain, you have to go approach the town, right? And the
No, eminent
municipality and have a discussion about it.
No,
You
it
takes
can't
some
just
money.
take it.
You can't
Yeah.
take eminent domain from a municipality.
Well, that's what I'm saying. I don't
It's
understand how that,
It's-
how that could have transpired without some notification to the
Yeah, that had to
municipality.
be, that's a legal process.
No, I know.
Yeah, I mean, but there's judgments and courts and all kinds
So
of stuff.
Steve, what do you see as a path forward here in a timeline? Do you
I don't know if I
see
can stay back on.
starting to have solidification of certain areas? Are you looking to do a master presentation? How do you see bringing some more solid evidence or proof of ownerships, or, what's your vision going
well,
forward
I'm
here?
doing the whole area, but I know Little Northwest Creek is in the news and priority, so, and it's also a good benchmark or canary in a coal mine, so to speak, for the rest of them, to say, well, if you own this one, why wouldn't you own others? So, I would rest assured that you own those. How somebody would prove that you either conveyed that creek or someone else took it, whether it be private upland owner or the state, I'd have to see that. I wouldn't consider that valid, my opinion.
Okay, and then in terms of timeline for a more formal presentation, are we looking at first quarter of next year?
Yeah, I mean, I have so much material, I didn't want to confuse you right now with it, but I'd say end of January. I think I can have a nice semblance of my map, and I mean, there's a narrative to this, a long narrative. There's a historiography as well. So historiography is, it's essentially like a technical history of history. So as an archivist, when I see a written history, I'm always skeptical. Who wrote this? What time period? What bias? What agenda did they might have? So with these trustee volumes and the town records that were published, the various editors, you have to be careful reading their interpretations of some of these. And I feel that there's, and Rick agrees with me, that there's a leaning at that time, this is in the 1920s and late 1800s, towards the proprietor rights over heirs, over trustees of the freeholders and commonalty. And really, to put it succinctly, I feel that that group that's pro-proprietor kind of forgot the word commonalty in the trustees of the freehold and the Dong and Pan. And honestly, I have so much evidence for this of land usage of these waters and beaches and roads. And that, to me, is so critical to establishing this. I mean, it's common sense, too. So, to answer your question, right now, my goal is spring with final, but end of January with something really substantial for you to digest, including written narrative, cartographic demonstration, and some other items. I mean, I have to take all of these deeds, thousands, and make sense of them for everybody. And to me, I do that cartographically. That's the best way.
Steve, can I just ask you about the treatment of the marshes adjacent to the creeks? Historically, were the, I mean, I always think of the trustees owning the bottom land of the harbors, but historically, how were the marshes, what were the marshes considered? Were they considered more of a part of the creek or more a part of the upland and ownership-wise?
They were, as we all know, valuable early, and there were some divisions quite early in the 1600s in that area, but then in earnest in the 1730s and 40s. That's when they called them divisions, and hundreds and hundreds, if not a few thousand, of those conveyances, we'll call them deeds. So let's say you drew lot 10 of a salt marsh or meadow. You were bounded by Rick's to the west, Jim's to the east, possibly by the beach to the north, and a creek to the south.
So these were,
Always.
this was common land that individuals had leases on, that they
Title.
could.
Title to
Title.
Title was conveyed. It's very confusing, but the best way to picture it is like a big jigsaw puzzle.
But the
So-
marsh was considered land. That could be allocated.
Oh.
And the
Well, the trustees also
Yeah,
leased
but
bottom land,
but
though, too.
was it land
Had
in
to
the
be
sense
bottom
that you could build on it, or was it in land in the sense that you had
Access.
rights to it?
Well, they had title because they were conveying it to their heirs. And that's why by 19-teens, you had people with 1/64 of 1/528 of a quarter of an eighth of a share. I mean,
Yeah.
is that,
No, but I, like,
so, that title.
in Ireland, we have that, but you can't build something on it. You have like a title to it's common land, you have title to a use, and it might be to harvest turf, it might be to graze livestock on, and you have grow oysters, whatever.
It was Saltair
grow.
was the
You have
primary
access
use,
to
though,
it.
was it not? I mean, for
For the
insulation.
marshes.
I think that my interpretation is that everything had a use. So like the woodlots seem to be for harvesting timber. Now, at some point, people started to live on that, and they may have quit, other heirs to one lot may have, quit claim to their brother, and now we had full title and said, you know what, wood's cheaper, New England was gonna build a house on it. I mean, I think I've seen enough evidence of that over time, but to answer your question, I think for a long time, they kept them just for harvesting the meadow, the grass. But those boundaries were not out into water, bodies of water.
But if a public entity owned a marsh adjacent to a creek, and if what Francis says is true, they could only transfer that to a private entity. But if, in the case of Little Northwest, if it's the state claiming ownership of the marsh, that would mean that the trustees would have had to convey that to the state at some point, or convey it to a public entity that then conveyed it to the state. And if that's not possible, is that valid? Is that a valid transfer?
It seems to me right now that the late 1880s and early 1900s, people with money, I mentioned the name monks, buying up big parcels in that area, and that would include the salt marshes, because by that time, I don't think the people were using them for that purpose. They considered them useless, or a lot of them may have left. There may have been very few. So if they were willing to pay for that, and then that was the private title, and then New York State. So we know Suffolk County in the 73 and 74 did a lot of those condemnation takings of salt marshes. That's what I'm trying to get my hands on right now as well. So that, I hope that answers your question. That would be the private.
There's a
So if
private
you-
ownership.
Yeah, if your great-great-grandfather drew lot 10, and you kept that salt marsh in your family, that lot, it doesn't mean Rick can go and cut grass. It's, the word common is very confusing, because it's common to them. So if there was a sheep pasture, and all of you had sheep in there, and I come into town, bring a sheep, oh, good, I have a place to put it. It doesn't work like that. It's common to you. The best way to think of it is like a condominium property.
It's a share.
Pool area and tennis courts are common to all of you, but I don't live there. I don't have that. And the way it worked was, you had roads, you had private title, say the town plot in 1648 that was laid out in a very typical New England style, north to south. And you were given, say, 4 acres for your home lot, private title. And, there were some restrictions. And then it was all based on the value, and you had certain rights elsewhere. So you had wood lots to cut your wood, and you could lease that to other people. But the critical thing is, like I said, think of a jigsaw puzzle where you hear the term or read about it, undivided lands. Well, that's where it gets a little confusing. Well, undivided, meaning we just haven't gotten to those yet. Those are wastelands that are just kind of in reserve until we divide them. We send our surveyors out, and by the late 1880s, when the railroad came and the people with money wanted waterfront access and ownership, that's where you start to see the wrangling of it and say, well, that was proprietor owned, therefore they could do what they want with it. And you heard discussion all night about the bays in Meatcox Bay. That was a famous case where the proprietors tried to claim they own that bottom. That was a huge lawsuit, and the trustees, the freeholders, won that. It was called the Free Bay versus Private Bay. So for our interests, those advocates of proprietor rights felt that the bottoms, the beaches, were private. I disagree with that. I agree 100% with the marshes and the woodlots and so forth, but not the beaches and the bodies of water. Again, I will demonstrate 1,000 times concrete examples of everybody in the town using these resources.
Yeah. What occurs when the water body moves?
Sorry?
What happens when the water body moves? As we're talking about with Little Northwest Creek.
That's I was helping.
Well, it moves through it's moving through the beach, though. So if the beach and the water body are considered the same
At least
type of
the
ownership.
people over there claim they own the beach.
Yeah,
Well,
they
he's,
probably don't own the
like
beach.
Steve's saying, that's a bogus claim.
That's
It's the same
that's
thing
tricky
with-
one. I was working on the Wading River, dividing between Riverhead Township and Brookhaven Township last year. And it turns out, because of the opening out into the sound, it shifted. And people who thought they were in Brookhaven were marooned in Riverhead. But yet they were still Brookhaven, but they couldn't use anything because they were on the other side. So it was like a, so I was asked to look into the historical record of what the bounds were, and it was to the center line of that creek, which is pragmatic. But they had to do. You know about that?
No, I'm saying it must be ambulatory then.
Yeah, yeah. And the Mississippi River's a big, there's a lot of case law on that.
Change every hour, right?
Chip thing, you know, but
And Little Northwest Creek is the eastern boundary of the village. It's the center of the creek. I recently looked at, I believe it was the incorporation papers for the village that were approved by the state in 1846, which it has Ligonier Brook on one side, and then there's a traverse to a tree, and then to the Little Northwest Creek in terms of being the boundary.
But that has nothing to do with ownership.
It may or may not. Yeah.
right now I'm overlaying with GIS the 1798 map of the town, manuscript map. It was required by law. New York State Office of the Surveyor General told every township, produce a survey of your town. And it was a 5-year project. And then up in Albany, they took all these big hand-drawn maps. It must have been a huge jigsaw puzzle. And they reduced the scale, and that gave us the modern map of New York State that we recognize today. So I'm taking that one and overlaying it. And I'll probably have to go out with GPS to get firm up some points, but I did this with Oyster Bay. And interestingly, the coastline on the North Shore, Cold Spring Harbor area, Center Island, matched exactly today. Strange. That's a story in and of itself. So doing things like that, a very micro gazetteer of place names for that area per century, you're gonna have it all. If you thought the Gardiner's Island report was tedious reading.
Well, it's fascinating, actually, right?
Yeah, sounds-
Historically,
sounds-
see the changes.
Sounds
and-
great.
I think you guys should be rest easy on those issues. The title to that creek and those bodies of water.
That's good news for us.
I'm sorry I didn't have the map for Christmas for you guys. That's what my game plan was, but it wouldn't look very
Still got a couple of
professional
weeks.
right now. So you
It's
gotta
just
wait.
something to look forward to in the new year.
Easter.
Yeah. It's much more important to get it accurate.
Thank you again, though.
Thank you.
And-
Steve, thank you.
Thanks very much.
Steve, even though you didn't get the map, you still get honey.
Dispensing, thank you. Yeah, it's wonderful honey from Jim.
That's Jim,
And Chris,
Jim's own honey.
you got it?
Yes, it's
Chris isn't
delicious.
shy, he got in there.
Yeah, he knows how the
He
game's
was missing
played.
one.
All he gets is good.
Oh, you have one? Okay. John, you have your honey, right?
Mike, in the back there.
Mike? Honey? Honey?
There are cookies up here.
Yeah, you'll lay last.
Lori brought them in for everybody.
Okay, we don't have, anybody else want to address the board?
Now we have the whole meeting.
Okay, let's see if we can fly through this and get home tonight. Old business, we have dredging of Georgica Pond. I think that refers to the,
You're awarding the bid.
yes.
Okay,
Oh, all right. I still have my stash from last year.
Start the next one.
Bill, why don't you talk about the dredging?
All right. We opened the bids. One person bid on it.
Do you have a copy of that?
Right
Yeah,
here.
it's in there.
Okay,
for
here.
him.
We received one bid,
Wait, Chris.
$6.50 a yard. And it was from Ken Roselle Incorporated. So,
You reviewed it, right? Yeah.
I reviewed it, I met with the successful bidder this Saturday. We went over the sort of meets and bounds of the bid proposal, and he seemed pretty
All right,
comfortable
thank
with
you.
it. And as the board knows, we have several applications and permits in place right now for revetment covering, so I'm sure all of that sand will go to good use.
so let's make a motion to accept the bid.
I'll make a motion to accept the bid.
I'll second it.
All in favor?
Aye.
Who's the contractor? Who's the contractor for this year? I didn't hear it.
Ken Roselle.
Oh, okay.
Anyway,
Okay. I didn't see that.
so we're all in favor, accepting the bid?
Yes.
Yes,
Okay.
I second it.
Transient mooring program.
I'm going to table this till after the first of the year. Still talking about a couple of issues with Mark Mendelman Insurance and pump out requirements for the boats.
Sorry, this-
He's in no rush.
Okay. All right. That's tabled. And last meeting, we talked about Clearwater Beach's permit. And it went out by email. I don't think everybody responded, or very few people responded to it, so I think this has to be.
Wrap that up. Did we not? We're all set.
Well, I thought it was going out by email for approval on a final writing on this, so.
Okay.
Oh,
Nobody
yes, you
responded.
responded.
Very
Rick.
few
I
responded.
I was
responded.
away.
Some individual responses.
Oh, you did?
Yeah,
So we're done.
we're done.
Yeah.
I'm the only person who
Awesome.
did not
Are we
respond.
voting though, please? Because I
No,
don't.
we're done.
We're done.
They did it already.
Well, I don't think. it
I'm
was-
not
it
certain.
wasn't a-
I'd rather vote twice.
Yeah, we need to,
It's not up to you.
it wasn't enough responses in the form of a vote. There was no vote responses. We need to vote on it tonight.
We need to vote on it tonight. Yeah, there's no official vote on this one.
So I'll make a
Well, what'd we
motion
do
to
last
approve the Clearwater Beach dredging
We
permit.
actually
Second.
voted last
Yeah, we
meeting
voted
to
2020.
accept it pending the adjustments that the board would make to it.
Right, which was the final draft that I saw Rick said looks good, go
Yeah.
ahead,
It-
right?
What were the adjustments, real quick? Can anybody?
We fine-tuned the new conditions. There were the three options that we offered, the three alternatives. There was.
We took out interscience as a,
And we changed the wording so they could take up to 3,900 yards, because every year is a different amount, and to lock them into one amount wasn't really accurate.
We had discussed this.
Yeah, so these were things that were covered. Chris was gonna make the adjustments, but we didn't seem to really get the approval on the email thread to really be, clear, for lack of a better term.
Right.
So, do we wanna vote now, or are we okay?
I think we definitely
thought-
need to,
I
because
agree.
I couldn't
I
find
would-
it on the,
You made the,
I'd make a
sure.
motion to approve the permit for Clearwater Beach and Lionhead. for-
Do I have a
I'll-
second?
I'll second it.
All in favor?
aye.
better to vote twice then.
any
I
opposed?
actually, I saw you had said go ahead, so I figured it was with the
Yeah,
dredging
just
harbor management group, so. Thank you, Chris, for fixing that.
You're welcome.
thank you, Chris.
All right, aquaculture, opening areas conditionally that are closed for shell fishing. You've been doing water testing.
Yeah, the DC's agreed to open the north section of Acabonic that's closed year-round in the conditional program.
Open the north end of Acabonic.
North end of Acabonic, under conditional program. It'll be open December 18th, and that'll run until sometime in April.
That's good news.
It's, Bill will be doing the rainfall readings. It'll be open anytime there's under .45 inches of rain. If there's .45 inches of rain, it'll close again for 7
Closes
days,
for 7 days.
unless there's more rain in those 7 days. There'll be a hotline number that people can call to determine whether the area is open or closed on a given day. That number is 631-324-6393. And
There's also a DEC number, I believe. A
That I
DEC shellfish hotline number.
And There'll be necessary water testing done throughout the period of opening, once a month, water testing. And I guess that's about it. So
Good
it'll
job,
open on
Ken.
the 18th.
That's
Great.
great. All right.
Of
Let
December?
APC people know
December.
that.
Okay.
What?
You know,
And
let
that's the
Aquatic
north
Protection
end
Committee
of the cove test.
know that.
Yeah, we have it all set up.
Yeah, right.
We used to do a lot.
Is there going to be a map possibly on
Mm-hmm.
We
town
got it started again.
shellfish site, or?
It'll be on the
Check
DEC's,
rainfall every morning.
you know, shellfish
And
website.
yesterday, we
Nice, nice.
It's there.
Okay, so this is what I'm going to relay to
Maybe we
APC
could
then?
put this map
You
and
can read my English?
the information on the town, on the trustee website.
Yeah, we could probably.
Great.
It's just a PDF.
All right, 3 Mile Harbor, we have a request to close out trustee permit number 3-19 issued to Gary Helfand, 37 Molina Drive. Suffolk
Oh,
County.
yeah, that was a staircase that was built, and it was built differently than the plan, so we held it up to see what the ZBA would do with the, basically the altered design. They've approved that in the last couple of weeks. I went down and looked at the, you know, where it meets the beach and the bluff, and it's tucked up to the bluff about as well as it can be, so. I'd
Is this
like-
one that you requested it being tucked in tighter?
Yeah.
We were looking at a while back.
Yeah, the
Perhaps,
contract
but the main issue was the design on the survey was a straight shot. They built it sort of a little bit of
Tiered
a
back and
tier
forth.
there, and
Mhm.
didn't get a, you know, revised permit to do that, so the ZBA took a while to review it, and they determined that was okay. But if you notice, it's in the within the beach grass line. I'm not sure how I know on the ocean beach, we have a ownership issue seaward of the beach grass line. On the bluff and the bay side, we've always referred to the toe of the bluff as the ownership line, but in some areas, there's beach grass that migrates out onto the beach, so. This one is tucked into the bluff, or, you know, right at the edge of the bluff, but beach grass extends beyond the staircase as well, so.
So what do you want to do?
So I make a motion that we close out this permit?
Have a second?
Second.
All in favor?
All right.
All right. Here are the bills. Staples, $149.40. Optimum, $141.04. Hamilton Marine, $132.92. And Hampton's Web Design, $150.
I make a motion to pay the bills.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
We have no minutes this month. Financial report for the month ended November 30th, 2019.
You know, I had a chance to look at them, and they look good month over month, you know, year over year. I did have one question that maybe we could just table this until next time. There was one line item that was a miscellaneous expenses that went from 0 to 13,823.
Dr. Goldler, Sag Harbor Water Quality, our accountant told us to put that incoming money under miscellaneous, and then we wrote the check out to him about
Okay.
2 weeks ago. But that's a good catch.
So did it go into another category and then out this one? Because, you know,
No, I
that
think
kind of
it
stuff's
went
like
in
a
as
pass-through.
miscellaneous, and
Okay.
I just followed her directions and what we did, and I'm not sure what to say when we wrote it
Okay,
out.
but monies did come in from the other municipalities.
We might not have written that check, I'm not sure
That's
when
on
we
the
wrote it.
expense side,
Yeah,
right?
this
The
is,
income
this
went
is
into
the expense
miscellaneous.
side, so the income must have
Where's-
gone to another category.
Is that the
Come in
the
at
consortium of Sag Harbor?
Yes,
Earlier
the
statement.
income should have been under
That's that
miscellaneous
group where all the money
Yeah.
comes in,
Yeah, yeah. So, but the money all was accounted for on the way in, is that correct, Arlene?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. All right, then I am good. That was the only thing that was a little bit unusual. But otherwise, they look very good.
Good catch.
Thank you. So I'd make a motion to approve the November.
I'll second that.
All in favor?
Aye.
And then we have the Norwalkie Smith financial statement. That was the town's
The audit.
audit.
Is that something we have to approve? Or
We
is
have
it
to
just
accept
really
it
a
or not
report?
accept it.
Yeah, it's kind of like getting old at this point, you know?
It's a shame.
Yeah.
We're almost into another year.
Yeah, they'll be
I took a
visiting us
look
in
at
about
it.
3 weeks.
Yeah,
hard
No,
it's gonna be
kidding.
hard to tell which one we're talking about.
I should have looked at it more closely.
I hate looking at this.
This is like,
Do you want to just break and accept it?
I'm gonna make a motion that we accept it as is.
I'll second it.
All in favor?
There you go.
Aye.
There you guys,
I-
we're rolling it together.
You should take a look at it.
Yeah, I will report back if there's any anomalies.
And renewal of certificate of deposit, and ended in number 6683.
I make a motion to renew.
All in favor?
Aye.
Okay, and report of the clerk, all I have is everybody, I hope you have a happy holiday, Merry Christmas,
Oh, I just-
Happy New Year.
I noticed that they're working on the East Jetty at 3 Mile Harbor.
Mhm.
Working really well.
Yeah.
Yeah,
We should have received,
they did notice, no, they
Noticed
noticed
us.
us.
All right, well, thank
Anybody
you very
else?
much for the honey,
Oh, and one
Mr.
other
Grimes.
thing, the kayaks and canoes are supposed to be off the kayak racks
Yeah.
in December.
They still
I
there?
don't know if there are any still there, but
there's a couple down at Mile Hill.
they won't be in a couple of weeks. If,
So December 1st is the cutoff? I thought it was November.
I believe it's December
Yeah,
1st.
that's the start of the cold weather rules.
If anybody's
Merry
still watching.
Christmas,
Merry
Merry Christmas.
Happy Hanukkah, Happy Kwanzaa.
Thank you, everybody.
Happy New Year.
Look forward to a new year coming.
So where you going?